Andrea Campbell's hands trembled as she packed 19 years into a cardboard box. Her nameplate, coffee mug, the files they didn't know existed. Brett Matthews smirked from his office doorway, already dividing her duties between two 20-somethings who couldn't spell fiduciary. What he didn't know was that Andrea had spent the last 6 months documenting every shortcut, every stolen client, every lie, and she had just filed the paperwork to buy the company. The Monday morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Pierce & Matthews Consulting on the 32nd floor, casting long shadows across polished marble floors that Andrea Campbell had walked across for 19 years. She arrived at 7:15, the same time she'd arrived every Monday for nearly 2 decades, her heels clicking a familiar rhythm against stone that had memorized her footsteps long ago. The office smelled like possibility at this hour, fresh coffee brewing in the break room, the faint scent of cleaning solution from the night crew, leather chairs that hadn't yet absorbed the weight of the day's meetings. Andrea moved through the space with practiced efficiency, flipping on lights, adjusting the thermostat to exactly 71 degrees because Doug Pierce liked it cool but not cold, starting the expensive espresso machine that Brett Matthews would use without acknowledgement in exactly 43 minutes. She settled at her desk, tucked into an alcove outside the partners' offices, visible but not intrusive, and opened her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she reviewed the day's schedule. Brett had a 9 o'clock with the Morrison account, Doug had back-to-back calls with potential clients, and there was the monthly operations meeting at 2, where she'd sit in the corner taking notes that no one would read but everyone would need when they forgot what was decided. Andrea's desk was a study in controlled organization. 3 monitors displayed color-coded calendars, spreadsheets tracking every project milestone, and a private document she kept meticulously updated with observations that would have surprised the partners if they'd known to look. Her coffee mug, white ceramic with a faded gold rim, a gift from her daughter Emma 10 years ago, sat on a coaster beside a framed photo of Emma at her college graduation, cap tilted at a jaunty angle, smile wide with possibility. At 7:45, Brett Matthews breezed through the glass doors, phone pressed to his ear, Italian leather briefcase swinging at his side. He was 48 but worked hard to look 38, with carefully maintained hair that was definitely dyed and a gym membership he mentioned in every conversation. He passed Andrea's desk without breaking stride, reaching for the espresso she'd prepared without looking at her, the same way someone might grab an umbrella from a stand. "Is someone handling my lunch reservation?" he asked into the air, still talking on. His phone. Andrea didn't look up from her screen. "Confirmed for 12:30 at Marcello's, your usual table." He grunted acknowledgement and disappeared into his office, door closing with a decisive click that said he was important and she was not. Doug Pierce arrived at 8, more rumpled than Brett, but with the easy confidence of someone whose name was literally on the building. His grandfather had founded the firm 60 years ago, which meant Doug had inherited respect he'd never quite earned. He at least smiled at Andrea as he approached her desk, the way someone might smile at a reliable appliance. "Andrea, would you mind terribly running by the dry cleaners today? I have that conference Thursday and I forgot to pick up my suits." Would you mind terribly? As if she had a choice. As if her job description included personal errands for a 52-year-old man who'd never learned to manage his own laundry. "Of course," Andrea said, her voice carrying none of the resentment settling like sediment in her chest. "I'll go during lunch." "You're a lifesaver," Doug said, already walking away. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Andrea smiled at his retreating back, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She knew exactly what they'd do without her. They'd flounder and blame someone else for the floundering. By 9 o'clock, the office hummed with activity. Junior consultants hurried between conference rooms, clutching tablets and coffee cups, their youth and energy filling the space with a restlessness that made Andrea feel simultaneously ancient and invisible. She was 52, with silver threading through honey blonde hair she wore in a practical twist, and lines around her eyes that came from squinting at spreadsheets and swallowing opinions for 19 years. The morning operations meeting gathered in the main conference room, a space with a view of Chicago's skyline that never failed to take Andrea's breath away, even after seeing it thousands of times. She sat in her usual spot at the far end of the table, laptop open, fingers poised to capture every word while contributing none of her own. Brett led the meeting with his characteristic swagger, discussing the Morrison account expansion with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to speak. "We need to push for a 3-year contract renewal," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Morrison's weak point is their supply chain management. We exploit that, show them our logistics solution, and we've got them locked in." Andrea's fingers paused over her keyboard. Morrison's weak point wasn't supply chain. It was communication between their regional offices. She'd spent the last year managing their account, had spoken to their operations director at least twice a week, knew their pain points better than she knew her own address. The supply chain issue Brett was fixating on had been resolved 6 months ago. She glanced up, caught Brett's eye, raised her hand slightly. Actually, Morrison resolved their supply chain issues last quarter. Their current challenge is... "Andrea, can you send around those quarterly reports after this?" Brett interrupted without looking at her, turning his attention to Carolyn Bennett, a junior associate with a fresh MBA in designer suits that cost more than Andrea's monthly mortgage. "Carolyn, what's your take on the supply chain angle?" Carolyn, 28 and sharp in the way of people who'd never been told they couldn't have something, leaned forward eagerly. "I think it's a strong approach. We position ourselves as forward-thinking, anticipating problems before they materialize." Andrea's jaw tightened. The problem had already materialized and been solved. They were about to walk into a meeting armed with outdated information, and she was being asked to send reports while others discussed strategy she'd developed. 5 minutes later, Brett said, "Here's what I'm thinking. We focus on their communication gaps between regional offices. That's their real vulnerability." The exact point Andrea had tried to make, but now it was Brett's insight, Brett's strategy, and Carolyn was nodding enthusiastically while taking notes that would help build her career on observations Andrea had made. The meeting ended with assignments distributed, and Andrea was left to clean up coffee cups and straighten chairs, while others hurried off to implement ideas that had originated at her desk. Back at her workspace, Andrea pulled up the Morrison file, a digital folder she'd maintained with meticulous detail for the past year. Every meeting summary, every email exchange, every strategic recommendation she'd made that Brett had later presented as his own. She scrolled through documents that represented hundreds of hours of her insight, her relationship building, her strategic thinking. Then she did something she'd been doing more frequently over the past 6 months. She opened a private folder labeled Personal Files and added today's observations to a document that was growing longer by the week. Times she'd been interrupted, ideas she'd contributed that were later credited to someone else. Instances where her title was used to diminish her expertise. It had started as therapy, a way to validate her own experience when she felt like she was going crazy. But it had evolved into something else, a chronicle of institutional dismissal, a paper trail of competence ignored. Her phone buzzed. A text from Patty Rodriguez, the administrative assistant in accounting. "Coffee after work? I need to vent." Andrea smiled. Patty was 10 years younger, a single mother who'd been working at the firm for 8 years and had the same exhausted look around her eyes that Andrea saw in her own mirror. They'd bonded over shared frustrations and the understanding that came from being essential but unacknowledged. "Definitely," Andrea typed back. "I'll bring the wine." The afternoon bled into evening with the usual chaos. Andrea fielded calls, rescheduled meetings, caught errors in reports before they reached clients, tracked down documents that consultants swore they'd saved but hadn't, and picked up Doug's dry cleaning during a lunch break she spent sitting in her car eating a protein bar. At 6:30, most of the office had emptied. Andrea was preparing tomorrow's briefing materials when she heard raised voices from Brett's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could see Brett and Doug inside, their faces serious in a way that made her stomach clench. "Have to restructure," Brett was saying. "We're paying for redundancy we don't need." "The board's been asking questions about overhead," Doug replied. "We need to show we're being proactive about efficiency." Andrea's hands stilled on her keyboard. Restructure. Efficiency. Corporate euphemisms that usually meant someone was losing their job. "What about Andrea?" Doug asked, and Andrea's heart stopped. Brett's laugh was sharp. "She's been here forever, expensive for what she does. We can bring in 2 junior assistants for what we're paying her. Fresh talent, eager to learn." "She knows this place inside and out," Doug said, but his tone was considering, not defending. "She's a secretary, Doug. A very good secretary, sure, but it's not like she's doing anything that can't be replaced. And frankly, we need to bring in some younger energy. Fresh perspective." Andrea sat frozen, her breath shallow. 19 years. 19 years of arriving early and staying late, of knowing everyone's preferences and fixing everyone's mistakes, of building relationships and solving problems and being the institutional memory of this place. And she was expensive for what she did. She saved her work with shaking hands, shut down her computer, and gathered her things in mechanical silence. The office felt different now, the familiar space suddenly hostile, the desk she'd occupied for nearly 2 decades, already belonging to someone else in their minds. She drove home on autopilot, the city lights blurring through tears. She refused to let fall until she was safely inside her modest apartment in Lincoln Park. The place was small, but hers, bought with her own salary, decorated with her own taste, filled with evidence of a life built on her own terms after her divorce 10 years ago. Andrea poured herself a glass of wine and sat on her couch, staring at nothing. Her ex-husband's words echoed in her memory. "You're born to support people, not lead them, Andrea. It's not an insult. It's just who you are." She'd believed him then. Believed that her role was to make others successful, that her satisfaction should come from their achievements. Even after he left her for his 26-year-old assistant, the cruelest possible confirmation that supporting others had no loyalty, no permanence, no real value in their eyes. Her phone buzzed. Emma calling. Andrea almost didn't answer, but her daughter had a sixth sense for when something was wrong. "Hey, sweetheart," Andrea said, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. "Mom, what's wrong?" Emma asked immediately. Andrea laughed, a sound without humor. "That obvious? You have your pretending everything's fine voice. What happened?" Andrea told her. The overheard conversation, the casual dismissal, the casual cruelty of being reduced to a line item that could be eliminated for efficiency. Emma's fury was instant and absolute. "Mom, you need to fight this. You need to lawyer up and sue them for age discrimination, sex discrimination, whatever applies. Honey, I don't know if they're actually going to fire me. I just overheard—" "Don't make excuses for them," Emma interrupted. "You've spent your whole life making excuses for people who don't deserve them. Dad, your bosses, even yourself. When are you going to get angry?" The question hung in the air. When was she going to get angry? Andrea looked around her apartment at the life she'd built from the ruins of her marriage. She'd survived divorce, raised a daughter alone, put herself through night school to get an associate degree in business administration that had never led to advancement because she was so valuable in her current role. She'd survived her father's death, her mother's dementia, the grinding exhaustion of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who everyone counted on but no one really saw. "I am angry," Andrea said quietly. "I'm furious. I'm just not sure what to do with it." "Then figure it out," Emma said, "because I've watched you make everyone around you successful my entire life. When is it your turn, Mom?" After they hung up, Andrea sat in the darkness of her living room, Emma's question echoing. When was it her turn? She thought about the files on her computer, 19 years of documentation, Every performance review praising her organizational skills, her client relationships, her strategic insights, always followed by explanations for why promotion wasn't possible. Your current role is so critical. We need you where you are. Perhaps in another year. She thought about the notebooks she kept, filled with observations about company operations, client needs, market opportunities. Notebooks she'd maintained thinking someday someone would ask for her input, would recognize that she saw patterns others missed. She thought about the billing discrepancies she'd discovered 3 months ago, money being diverted incorrectly on Brett's client accounts. She'd brought it to Doug, who dismissed it as probably just an error, told her not to worry about things above her pay grade. She documented it anyway, because that's what she did. She documented everything. Andrea opened her laptop and looked at her private files with new eyes. This wasn't just therapeutic journaling. This was evidence. Evidence of competence systematically ignored. Evidence of contributions deliberately credited to others. Evidence of a woman who'd been running things from behind the scenes while being told she wasn't qualified to sit at the table. A dangerous thought began to form in her mind. A thought so audacious it made her hands shake. What if she didn't just fight back? What if she took something back? She pulled up the firm's financial records, files she had access to because someone needed to organize them, and secretaries were assumed to be invisible even when handling sensitive information. She looked at client retention rates, revenue trends, operational costs. She saw what Brett and Doug probably didn't because they were too busy taking credit to actually analyze data. Pierce & Matthews Consulting was struggling. Client satisfaction was down. Staff turnover was increasing. The partners were spending lavishly on business development, expensive dinners, golf outings, conferences in tropical locations, while the actual work of maintaining client relationships fell to people like Andrea, who were considered overhead. The company was vulnerable in ways the partners didn't realize because they'd spent so long not paying attention to the details that made everything work. Andrea thought about Vivian Clark, a former executive who'd retired from the firm 6 months ago at a company party. Vivian had pulled Andrea aside that night, wine in hand, and said something that had stuck. "They pushed me out before I was ready, Andrea. Called it retirement, but we both know what it was. I wish I'd fought back. I wish I'd claimed what I'd earned instead of gracefully accepting what they decided to give me." Vivian had left her business card. "If you ever want to talk," she'd said, "woman to woman, not colleague to colleague." Andrea found that card now, tucked into her wallet where she'd kept it like a talisman. It was 10 o'clock on a Sunday night, but she had Vivian's cell number. She dialed before she could talk herself out of it. Vivian answered on the third ring. "Andrea Campbell, it's been too long." "They're going to fire me," Andrea said without preamble, "and I'm thinking about doing something crazy." There was a pause. Then Vivian's voice came back warm with interest. "I'm listening." Andrea took a deep breath. "What would it take to buy the company?" Vivian's laugh was surprised and delighted. "Now that is not what I expected you to say. Tell me more." They talked for 2 hours. Vivian asked pointed questions about the company's financial health, client relationships, operational vulnerabilities. Andrea answered with the comprehensive knowledge of someone who'd been paying attention for 19 years, while others assumed she was just taking notes. "You've been running this company from behind the scenes," Vivian said finally. "You know that, right?" "I've been supporting—" Andrea started automatically. "No," Vivian interrupted firmly. "Supporting is what you tell yourself to make peace with being undervalued. You've been strategizing, managing relationships, solving problems, and keeping operations running. That's not supporting. That's leading without the title or the compensation." The words hit Andrea like a physical force. Leading without the title. How many decisions had she made that were rubber-stamped by Brett and Doug? How many client crises had she solved before they even knew there was a crisis? How many junior consultants had she trained? Projects had she rescued? Opportunities had she identified? "I have some capital," Vivian said, "and I have friends with capital, women who've been waiting for the right opportunity to invest in female-led ventures. If you're serious about this, Andrea, I'll help you. Not because I feel sorry for you, because I see an opportunity and I see a woman who's finally ready to stop asking for permission." After they hung up, Andrea sat in the darkness feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope, exactly. Something fiercer. Something that felt like possibility and rage braided together into purpose. She opened a fresh document on her laptop and titled it, Acquisition Strategy. Then she began to write everything she knew about Pierce and Matthews Consulting, every weakness, every opportunity, every relationship she'd built, every insight she'd developed. She wrote until her fingers cramped and her vision blurred, documenting 19 years of institutional knowledge that had been invisible because she'd been invisible. When she finally fell into bed at 3 a.m, Andrea dreamed of corner offices and conference rooms where her voice carried weight. She dreamed of being seen. She had no idea if what she was planning was possible, but she knew with absolute certainty that she was done waiting for permission to claim what she'd earned. The next morning, Andrea arrived at the office at 7:15 as always, but everything felt different. She moved through her routine, lights, coffee, calendars, with the strange detachment of someone who was already halfway gone. Tuesday passed in a blur of meetings and emails and small dismissals that had become so routine she barely registered them anymore, except now she did register them. Now she noticed every time Brett took credit for her work, every time Doug asked her to handle his personal errands, every time Carolyn rolled her eyes at her suggestions. On Wednesday, Andrea had lunch with Patty Rodriguez at a small cafe 3 blocks from the office. Patty looked exhausted, her dark hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail, her blazer wrinkled from a morning spent chasing down receipts that a consultant had lost. "I'm losing my mind," Patty said, stabbing at her salad. "Brett's expense reports are a disaster, again. And when I asked for clarification on a charge, he told me I was being nitpicky. $2,300 at a strip club is apparently client entertainment." Andrea's attention sharpened. Strip club? Yeah, and that's not even the worst one. There are charges to personal trainers, a golf club membership, even a payment to what looks like a sports betting account, all labeled business expenses. "That's not legal," Andrea said slowly. Patty looked around nervously. "I know, but what am I supposed to do? Report it to Doug? He's just as bad. Report it to the board? I'll get fired for making trouble." Andrea made a decision. "Patty, can you do something for me? Can you document everything? Every questionable expense, every charge that doesn't make sense. Keep it private, just for yourself." Patty studied her. "Why?" "Because someday someone might need evidence that things weren't being run properly, and when that day comes, it would be good to have documentation." "Are you planning something?" Patty asked. Andrea smiled. "I'm planning to protect myself, and maybe you too, if you're willing." That afternoon, Andrea called Margaret Winters, the attorney Vivian had recommended. Margaret was in her early 60s, with steel gray hair and a reputation for not suffering fools. "Vivian Clark called me," Margaret said when Andrea arrived at her office downtown. "She says you're thinking about making an acquisition. Bold move for someone who's about to be terminated. How did you—" "I've been doing this 30 years, Ms. Campbell. I know the patterns. Company restructures, long-term employee gets pushed out. Usually someone female, usually someone over 40. So let's skip the preliminaries. Tell me what you're thinking." Andrea spread out the documents she'd brought. 19 years of performance reviews, the strategic analyses she'd written, evidence of the billing discrepancies she'd flagged. She explained about overhearing Brett and Doug, about the company's vulnerabilities, about Vivian's offer to help. Margaret listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes scanning documents with practiced efficiency. You have grounds for a wrongful termination suit if they fire you, Margaret said finally. Age discrimination, possibly sex discrimination. The billing irregularities give you whistleblower protections, but that's defensive. You're talking about playing offense. I want to buy the company, Andrea said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that terrified and exhilarated her. I want to take the company I've been running from behind the scenes and actually run it, with my name on it, with my vision guiding it. Margaret sat back, a slight smile playing at her lips. Do you know what I like about this plan? It's not revenge, it's justice. You're not trying to destroy them, you're trying to claim what you've earned. Can I actually do this? Andrea asked. Is it even possible? Let me research the company's financial situation, Margaret said, quietly. See what the real valuation is, whether there are acquisition opportunities. If they're as vulnerable as you think, they might be more open to an offer than you'd expect, especially if that offer comes with a solution to problems they're not handling well. Andrea left the attorney's office, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff, but for the first time in 19 years, she felt like she was moving forward instead of treading water. Friday afternoon at 4:30, Andrea was called into the conference room. Brett and Doug were there, along with Howard Fisher from HR. The Friday afternoon meeting, the classic coward's timing. Howard did most of the talking, his voice carefully neutral. Andrea, we appreciate your years of service to Pierce and Matthews. However, we're restructuring the administrative functions, and we've made the difficult decision to eliminate your position. Eliminate your position, not fire you. Eliminate the position, as if she was a line item, not a person. We're prepared to offer 2 weeks severance, Doug added, not quite meeting her eyes. In recognition of your service, 2 weeks for 19 years. Andrea felt something cold and sharp crystallize in her chest. Brett was already looking at his phone, barely present. This was routine for him. Firing people was just another task to check off before the weekend. I'd like the offer in writing, Andrea said calmly, and 24 hours to review it before I respond. Brett's head snapped up, irritation flickering across his face. This is the offer, Andrea. It's generous considering... Considering what? Andrea interrupted, her voice steady. Considering I've spent 19 years doing your job while you took credit for it. The room went silent. Doug shifted uncomfortably. Howard looked down at his papers. Let's not make this difficult, Doug said with forced warmth. You've been a valuable employee. We're simply moving in a new direction. Andrea stood slowly, gathering her dignity like armor. I'll have my response Monday morning. She walked out before they could object, her heels clicking against marble that no longer felt like home. If you've ever felt invisible at work or had your contributions overlooked, drop a heart emoji in the comments. And if you're ready to see how Andrea turns the tables, make sure you're subscribed. This journey is just beginning. Back at her desk, Andrea began the surreal task of packing 19 years into cardboard boxes. Her coffee mug, the photo of Emma, files they didn't know were important, and the accordion folder she'd been maintaining, her documentation, her evidence, her ammunition. Brett appeared in his doorway, arms crossed, watching her pack with barely concealed satisfaction. Shouldn't take you too long, he said. It's not like you had much anyway. Andrea looked at him directly, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. Not the confident executive she'd spent years supporting, just a mediocre man who'd been propped up by people he'd never bothered to value. You're right, she said quietly. I didn't have much here, but that's about to change. She carried her boxes to her car, feeling lighter with each step. The weight she was shedding wasn't the contents of her desk. It was the weight of making herself small, of accepting crumbs, of believing she wasn't entitled to more. That evening, Andrea sat in her apartment surrounded by boxes and made phone calls to Margaret Winters, to Vivian Clark, to 3 other former executives Vivian connected her with, women who had capital and an appetite for backing female-led ventures. "I'm serious about this," Andrea told them. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." By Sunday night, Andrea had assembled a preliminary investor group, secured legal counsel, and begun the formal process of researching an acquisition offer. Margaret had done preliminary financial analysis and confirmed what Andrea suspected. Pearson Matthews was more vulnerable than it appeared, with declining client retention and bloated operational costs. "Their valuation is lower than they probably realize," Margaret said over the phone. "If you can demonstrate the strategic value you bring, the client relationships, the operational knowledge, the institutional memory, you might have a legitimate chance." Monday morning, Andrea didn't go to the office. Instead, she went to Margaret's downtown firm and signed documents that would change her life. Papers authorizing Margaret to act as her legal representative. Papers forming an LLC. Papers that would eventually carry an acquisition offer to Pierce and Matthews Consulting. Then she emailed her response to the severance offer. "Declined. My attorney will be in touch regarding alternative proposals." Brett called within the hour, furious. "What the hell is this, Andrea? Some kind of power play?" "It's a business decision," Andrea said calmly. "Something you taught me. Everything is just business." She hung up and allowed herself a small smile. The woman who'd spent 19 years apologizing for taking up space had just hung up on her former boss, and she was just getting started. Chapter 2. The week that followed Andrea's termination felt like living in two worlds simultaneously. In one world, she was an unemployed 52-year-old woman with a mortgage and dwindling savings, scrolling through job postings that required degrees she didn't have or experience in roles she'd never been allowed to hold. In the other world, she was assembling an acquisition team, analyzing financial statements, and planning something so audacious she could barely believe she was doing it. Tuesday afternoon, Andrea met Vivian Clark at a small bistro in the West Loop. Vivian arrived in a crisp linen suit, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob that spoke of confidence and expensive stylists. She looked like everything Andrea had never been allowed to become. "You look terrified," Vivian said, sliding into the booth across from Andrea. "I am terrified," Andrea admitted. "I keep asking myself who I think I am, trying to buy a company." Vivian leaned forward, her gaze intense. "Let me tell you who you are. You're the woman who held that company together for 19 years. You know every client, relationship, every operational system, every weakness in their strategy. You've been doing the work of leadership without the title or the pay. The only difference now is you're finally admitting it. But I don't have business school credentials. I don't have—" "Andrea," Vivian's voice was firm. "Stop apologizing for what you don't have and start claiming what you do. I've watched you work for years. I've seen you solve problems that Brett and Doug couldn't even identify. I've watched you manage client crises with more grace and skill than anyone in that office. Do you know why I'm investing in you?" Andrea shook her head. "Because competence recognizes competence, and I'm tired of watching men fail upward while women like us wait for permission that will never come." The words settled into Andrea's chest like stones, solid and grounding. Permission that would never come. "Tell me about the clients," Vivian said, pulling out a tablet. "Who would come with you if you left?" Andrea thought about the relationships she'd built over 19 years. Robert Fitzgerald at Fitzgerald Industries, who always asked to speak with her specifically when he called. Sandra Morrison at Morrison Technologies, who'd sent Andrea a Christmas card every year. David Chen at Chen Pharmaceuticals, who'd once told her she was the only person at the firm who actually understood his business. "Fitzgerald would come," Andrea said slowly. "We've worked together for 15 years. He barely tolerates Brett. Morrison would at least listen. She's been unhappy with service quality lately. Chen might be interested if we approached him right." "That's 3 major accounts," Vivian said, making notes. "Enough to build credibility. What about the staff? Who would follow you?" Andrea thought about Patty Rodriguez in accounting, about Howard Fisher in HR who'd looked ashamed during her termination meeting, about the junior consultants she'd mentored who'd never questioned why she was giving them strategic advice if she was just a secretary. "More than they realize," Andrea said. "Brett and Doug think loyalty is about paychecks, but people remember who helped them, who saw their potential, who treated them like human beings." Over the next hour, they built what Vivian called the Dream Team, a list of potential allies, investors, and strategic partners. Vivian had already secured preliminary commitments from 3 other retired executives, all women who'd been pushed out of their companies before they were ready and who saw Andrea's venture as both an investment opportunity and a form of vindication. "We need one more thing," Vivian said as they prepared to leave. "We need you to believe you can actually do this. Because right now, you're planning this acquisition like you're asking permission to exist. You need to walk into negotiations like you already own the company, because in every way that matters, you do." That evening, Andrea sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and her notebooks building something Margaret had called the narrative, the story of why she should own Pierce & Matthews, told not through credentials but through evidence. She compiled every client testimonial that had mentioned her by name, every project she'd rescued from disaster, every strategic recommendation she'd made that had been implemented successfully, every time a consultant had come to her for advice and the advice had worked. She built a portfolio that told a story Brett and Doug had never bothered to read, the story of the company's actual success and who had been driving it. By midnight, Andrea had a document that made her hands shake to read, not because it was exaggerated or false, but because it was true. And seeing the truth assembled in one place was overwhelming. She'd been leading this company for years. She just hadn't been allowed to call it that. Wednesday morning, Margaret called with news. "I've had preliminary conversations with the Pierce & Matthews Board of Directors. They're concerned about the company's performance decline. Client retention is down 15% over the last year. 2 senior consultants have left, and they're asking questions about the partners' expense accounts." "They know about Brett's spending?" Andrea asked. "They're starting to ask the right questions. And here's the interesting part. When I mentioned there might be acquisition interest from a party with deep institutional knowledge and existing client relationships, they were very interested in hearing more." Andrea's heart hammered. "They don't know it's me yet?" "Not yet. But they will soon. The question is, are you ready for them to know?" Andrea thought about Brett's smirk as he'd watched her pack, about Doug's hollow appreciation for her years of service, about 19 years of being told she was valuable where she was, which was code for not valuable enough to promote. "I'm ready," Andrea said. Thursday afternoon, Andrea did something that terrified her more than the acquisition planning. She reached out to her old clients, not to complain about Pierce & Matthews, not to badmouth the firm, just to let them know she was available for independent consulting work. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Robert Fitzgerald called within an hour. "Andrea, I heard they let you go. Those idiots. Are you really doing independent work?" "I'm exploring options," Andrea said carefully. "I wanted to reach out personally because our relationship has always mattered to me." "Well, it matters to me too," Fitzgerald said. "In fact, I've been unhappy with Pierce & Matthews since you left. The new people don't understand our business the way you do. If you're available, I'd like to hire you directly, contract work, whatever you need." By Friday, Andrea had 3 consulting contracts signed: Fitzgerald Industries, Chen Pharmaceuticals, and a smaller firm she'd been working with for years. It wasn't enough to live on long term, but it was. Enough to prove something crucial. Her value wasn't tied to Pierce & Matthews. Her value was portable, was real, was based on relationships she'd built and expertise she'd developed. She was standing in her kitchen, staring at the signed contracts spread across her counter when her phone rang. "Emma. Mom, I'm coming over. I'm bringing wine and takeout. You're going to tell me everything." An hour later, Andrea sat on her couch with her daughter, Chinese food containers scattered across the coffee table, and told her the whole story. The overheard conversation, the termination, the crazy plan to buy the company, the consulting contracts, the investor group. Emma listened with wide eyes, occasionally interrupting with questions or expressions of fury at Brett and Doug. When Andrea finished, Emma was quiet for a long moment. "Mom," she said finally, "my entire life I've watched you make other people successful. Dad built his career while you supported him. Your bosses got promoted on work you did. Even me. You put yourself through night school while raising me alone. You've spent your entire life being the foundation everyone else built on." "That's what mothers do," Andrea said. "What wives do. What women are told to do," Emma interrupted. "But you know what I've never seen you do? Put yourself first. Take credit. Demand what you're worth. I've never seen you be selfish, Mom. And honestly, it's time you were a little selfish." Andrea felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared I'll fail and prove them all right, that I really am just a secretary with delusions of grandeur." Emma grabbed her mother's hands. "Mom, you're the most competent person I know. You managed an entire household alone. You put yourself through college while working full-time and raising a kid. You've been managing a company for 19 years while being paid as an assistant. If that's not leadership, what is?" "But what if I'm not enough?" Andrea whispered. "Then you'll learn. You'll adapt. You'll do what you've always done. Figure it out and keep going. But you know what's worse than failing while trying? Never trying at all. Never knowing if you could have done it." After Emma left, Andrea sat alone in the darkness of her living room. She thought about her father, who died when she was 23, before he'd seen her marry or have Emma or build any kind of life. He'd been a factory worker, proud but limited, who'd always told her, "Work hard, keep your head down, and people will take care of you." Except they didn't. People didn't take care of you for working hard. They took advantage. They took credit. They took what you built and called it theirs. Andrea pulled out her laptop and opened a document. At the top, she wrote, "Why I should own Pierce and Matthews Consulting." Then she began to write, not with the apologetic tone of someone asking for permission, but with the clarity of someone stating facts. "I should own this company because I've been running it for 19 years. I should own it because I know every client relationship, every operational system, every strategic opportunity. I should own it because I've solved problems the current leadership couldn't identify. I should own it because I've earned it." She saved the document and felt something shift inside her. A door closing on the woman who apologized for existing, and another door opening for someone new. The following Monday, Margaret submitted a formal letter of intent to the Pierce and Matthews Board of Directors. The letter didn't reveal Andrea as the potential buyer yet. That revelation would come later. It simply indicated that a qualified party with intimate knowledge of the company's operations and established client relationships was interested in acquisition discussions. Brett called Andrea's cell phone 6 times that day. She didn't answer. Let him wonder, let him sweat. Tuesday morning, Andrea met with Vivian and the other potential investors. 3 women in their 50s and 60s who'd built successful careers and sold companies and were now looking for meaningful places to put their capital and expertise. Patricia Nguyen had been a CFO at a Fortune 500 company before retiring at 58 when her company merged and her position was restructured. Helen Kowalski had built a marketing firm from scratch and sold it for 8 figures. Ruth Goldstein had been a management consultant for 30 years before starting her own boutique firm. They met in a conference room at Margaret's law firm, and Andrea felt like an imposter walking in. These were women with impressive resumes and executive presence and credentials she'd never have. But then Patricia spoke. "Andrea, Vivian has told us your story. I want you to know. I see myself in you. I spent 20 years being the smartest person in the room and being told I needed more experience, more education, more something. The real something I needed was permission to stop waiting. I was a secretary once too," Helen added. "Worked my way up, but it took 15 years longer than it should have because people couldn't see past my title. When I finally started my own firm, people asked me where I got the audacity. You know what I told them? The same place men get it, from knowing my own worth." Andrea felt something loosen in her chest. She wasn't alone. She wasn't crazy. She was part of a long line of women who'd been underestimated and had learned to turn that underestimation into power. "I'm scared I'll let you down," Andrea admitted, "that I'll prove I'm not ready for this." "Ready is a myth," Ruth said. "No one is ready to lead until they're already leading. The question isn't whether you're ready. It's whether you're willing to learn in public, to make mistakes and correct them, to be imperfect while still being competent. That's what real leadership looks like." They spent the next 3 hours building the acquisition structure. Vivian would be COO, bringing operational expertise. Patricia would oversee finances. Helen would handle business development and marketing. Ruth would serve as strategic advisor. Andrea would be CEO. The title felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd only ever read. "I don't have an MBA," Andrea said. "Don't I need?" "Barack Obama didn't have business experience when he became president," Helen interrupted. "Leadership isn't about credentials. It's about vision, judgment, and the ability to bring out the best in people. You've been doing all three for years. You just weren't getting credit." That afternoon, Margaret called with an update. "The board wants to meet the potential buyer. They're intrigued by someone with institutional knowledge. Brett and Doug are pushing back hard, saying an outsider buying the company would be disastrous. They don't know yet that the outsider is you." "When do they want to meet?" Andrea asked. "Friday, 2 p.m. Are you ready to show them who you are?" Andrea thought about 19 years of being dismissed, 19 years of being told she was valuable where she was, 19 years of watching less competent people get promoted while she was praised for being a team player. "I'm ready," she said. The intervening days were a blur of preparation. Andrea worked with Vivian to develop a presentation that showcased not just why Pearson Matthews was a good investment, but why she specifically should lead it. They compiled client testimonials, performance metrics showing decline under current leadership, and a strategic vision for the company's future. Patty Rodriguez met Andrea for coffee Wednesday afternoon, looking nervous and excited. "I did what you asked," Patty said, sliding a folder across the table. "All of Brett's questionable expenses, documented, cross-referenced. It's worse than I thought, Andrea. He's been systematically overbilling clients and pocketing the difference. Small amounts, but consistent. If this got out..." "It could be fraud charges," Andrea finished. She looked at the documentation with a mixture of vindication and sadness. This was the man who'd called her just a secretary, who dismissed her as replaceable, and he'd been stealing from clients while doing it. "Are you really going to try to buy the company?" Patty asked. Andrea met her friend's eyes. "I'm not trying. I'm doing it. And when I do, I want you with me. Not as an administrative assistant, as director of operations, if you want it." Patty's eyes filled with tears. "Are you serious?" "You've been tracking operational inefficiencies for 8 years, Patty. You've been solving problems no one acknowledged. You deserve a title that reflects what you actually do. So yes, I'm serious." They hugged over coffee cups and half-eaten pastries, two women who'd been invisible deciding to be seen. Thursday evening, Andrea stood in front of her bedroom mirror, practicing her presentation. She'd bought a new suit. Charcoal gray, well-tailored, expensive. The kind of suit she'd never bought before because secretaries didn't need power suits. But she wasn't a secretary anymore. She practiced her opening. "Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Campbell, and I'm here to discuss acquiring Pierce & Matthews Consulting." Her voice shook the first 5 times. By the 20th, it was steady. Emma came over to help her prepare, bringing moral support and fashion advice. "You need to take off the reading glasses," Emma said. "You hide behind them when you're nervous." "I need them to see," Andrea protested. "You need them to hide. There's a difference. Wear contacts tomorrow, stand up straight, make eye contact. Act like you already own the room and they'll believe you do." Andrea looked at her daughter. When had Emma become so wise? And realized she was getting advice from someone she'd raised, someone who'd watched her mother be diminished and had learned not to accept the same fate. "I'm doing this for you, too," Andrea said quietly, "so you never have to spend 19 years being invisible." "I know, Mom," Emma said, hugging her, "but mostly, I think you're doing it for yourself, and it's about time." Friday morning, Andrea woke at 5 a.m., too nervous to sleep. She showered, dressed carefully in her new suit, put in contacts that felt strange after years of glasses. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like a CEO, polished, confident, ready. It was all a performance, but maybe that was okay. Maybe confidence was just fear that had learned to stand up straight. At 1:30, Andrea arrived at Margaret's law firm. Vivian was already there, along with Patricia, Helen, and Ruth. They looked like a board of directors. They looked like power. "You ready?" Vivian asked. "No," Andrea said honestly, "but I'm doing it anyway." They walked into the Pearson Matthews building at 1:55. Andrea's stomach clenched as she passed the security desk where she'd signed in every morning for 19 years. The guard didn't recognize her. She'd been invisible even to him. The board met in the main conference room on the 32nd floor. Andrea walked in and felt time slow down. Brett and Doug were there, looking annoyed at having their Friday afternoon interrupted. 3 board members sat at the table: Michael Torres, the board chair, Susan Hammond, a retired attorney, and James Chen, an investor who'd been on the board for 15 years. They looked up as Andrea entered, and she watched recognition dawn on their faces. Confusion, surprise, and in Brett's case, absolute fury. "What the hell is this?" Brett exploded, standing up. "Andrea, you're the interested buyer. This is a joke." "Sit down, Mr. Matthews," Michael Torres said coolly. "Let's hear what Miss Campbell has to say." Andrea moved to the front of the room, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She met Brett's glare, Doug's bewildered expression, and then focused on the board members. "Good afternoon," she said, and her voice was clear, strong, exactly as she'd practiced. "My name is Andrea Campbell. I worked as executive assistant at Pearson Matthews for 19 years until my position was eliminated 2 weeks ago. I'm here today to discuss acquiring this company." Brett laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "This is absurd. She's a secretary. She has no business experience, no capital, no credentials." "I have 19 years of experience running this company behind the scenes," Andrea interrupted, and the room went silent. "I have relationships with every major client, knowledge of every operational system, and a track record of solving problems that current leadership couldn't identify. I have an investor group," she gestured to Vivian and the others, "with combined experience of over 100 years in executive leadership. And I have a vision for this company's future that's based on actual operational excellence, not expense accounts disguised as business development." She pulled up the first slide of her presentation. It showed client retention rates over the past 5 years, with a sharp decline in the last 18 months. "Pearson Matthews is bleeding clients," Andrea said. "You've lost 15% of your client base this year alone. Do you know why?" Chapter 3. Andrea clicked to the next slide. It showed client testimonials, names redacted but quotes highlighted. "Service quality has declined. We don't feel valued anymore. The person who understood our business is no longer there." These are from exit interviews with former clients, Andrea said. What they're describing isn't a failure of strategy. It's a failure of relationships, and relationships are built by people who pay attention, who care, who see clients as partners rather than revenue streams. She looked directly at Brett. "I built most of those relationships. I maintained them, and when I left, they left too." Susan Hammond leaned forward, interest sharp in her eyes. "Ms. Campbell, you mentioned an investor group. Can you tell us more about their qualifications?" Andrea gestured to Vivian, who stood smoothly. "Vivian Clark, former COO of Pearson Matthews until my retirement 6 months ago. I have 40 years of operational experience and significant capital to invest. I'm backing Ms. Campbell because I've watched her lead from behind for years, and I believe it's time she led from the front." One by one, Patricia, Helen, and Ruth introduced themselves. Impressive credentials, significant capital, genuine belief in Andrea's vision. Doug found his voice. "Andrea, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but this is unrealistic. You don't have experience in executive leadership. Running a company is vastly different from providing administrative support." Andrea had prepared for this. She clicked to a new slide showing a list of responsibilities. "In the past year, alone, I've managed the Morrison account transition, resolved the Fitzgerald contract dispute, implemented a new project management system, trained 6 new consultants, and identified the billing discrepancies that Mr. Matthews here has been hoping no one would notice." Brett's face went pale. "That's a lie. I don't know what she's talking about." Andrea pulled out a folder, slid it across the table to the board members. Documentation of irregular billing on the Morrison, Fitzgerald, and Chen accounts. Small overcharges, consistently diverted to accounts Mr. Matthews controls. My former colleague in accounting, Patty Rodriguez, has been documenting these discrepancies for months. She'll testify to their accuracy. Michael Torres opened the folder, his expression darkening as he reviewed the contents. James Chen did the same, and Andrea watched understanding dawn on their faces. "This is defamation," Brett sputtered. "She's making this up because she's bitter about being fired." "The numbers are in your own accounting system," Andrea said calmly. "They're easily verifiable. I'm not here to destroy anyone's reputation. I'm here to offer a solution to a company that's struggling under leadership that's been more focused on personal gain than client service." Susan Hammond spoke. "Ms. Campbell, what exactly are you proposing?" Andrea took a breath. This was it. The moment where she either claimed her future or walked away. "I'm proposing to acquire controlling interest in Pearson Matthews for fair market value, which based on current financial performance is lower than the company's valuation 3 years ago. I'm proposing to restructure leadership with myself as CEO and Vivian Clark as COO. I'm proposing to rebuild client relationships, implement operational improvements, and create a company culture based on merit rather than connections." She clicked to her final slide. It showed a vision statement. Excellence through authenticity, leadership through service, success through people. "I don't have an MBA, Andrea said. "I don't have a corner office pedigree. What I have is 19 years of knowing how this company actually works, who makes it run, and what it could become if someone bothered to lead with competence instead of ego." The room was silent. Andrea could hear her own heartbeat, could feel sweat prickling at the back of her neck despite the cool air conditioning. Michael Torres looked at Brett and Doug. "Gentlemen, would you excuse us? We'd like to speak with Ms. Campbell and her team privately." Brett looked like he was about to explode. "You can't seriously be considering this. She's a secretary with delusions of—" "Mr. Matthews," Michael Torres interrupted, his voice cold. "I suggest you leave before I start asking more questions about these billing irregularities. We'll be in touch." Brett stormed out, Doug following with a backward glance at Andrea that mixed shock with something that might have been respect. Once they were gone, Michael Torres leaned back in his chair. "Miss Campbell, that was quite a presentation, but I have to ask, why should we trust you to lead this company when you've never held an executive position?" Andrea had known this question was coming. She'd rehearsed her answer a dozen times. But now, standing in this room where she'd spent years being invisible, the words came from somewhere deeper than rehearsal. "You shouldn't trust me because of my credentials," she said. "You should trust me because I've already been doing the work. Every strategic decision Brett took credit for, I did the analysis. Every client crisis Doug resolved, I handled it. Every operational improvement over the past 5 years, I implemented it. The only difference between what I've been doing and what a CEO does is that I wasn't getting paid for it, and no one was calling it leadership." She looked at each board member in turn. "I'm not asking you to take a chance on potential. I'm asking you to recognize performance you've already been benefiting from. You've been profiting from my leadership for 19 years. I'm just asking you to acknowledge it and compensate it fairly." Susan Hammond smiled slightly. "That's a compelling argument. What do you see as the company's biggest vulnerability right now?" Andrea didn't hesitate. "Culture. This company has operated on a model where credit flows upward and blame flows downward. People who actually do the work are invisible. People who take credit are promoted. That model worked when we could coast on reputation, but it's unsustainable. Clients want competence, not credentials. Staff want recognition, not platitudes. If I take over, the first thing I change is who gets seen and who gets valued." James Chen spoke for the first time. "Ms. Campbell, I've been on this board for 15 years. I've watched 3 CEOs cycle through. None of them lasted more than 5 years because they couldn't maintain the client relationships that are this company's foundation. If what you're saying is true, that you built and maintained those relationships, then you might be exactly what we need." "Let me be clear about something," Andrea said. "I'm not doing this for revenge. Brett and Doug created a system that benefited them, and they operated within that system. I'm doing this because I finally realized I've been subsidizing other people's success my entire career, and I'm done. I'm done waiting for permission. I'm done making myself small. I'm done accepting that being underestimated is just how life works for women like me." She paused, feeling emotion rise in her throat. "I have a daughter who's watching to see what I do next, and I refuse to teach her that working hard and being competent isn't enough. I refuse to model acceptance. I'm modeling fighting for what you've earned." The board members exchanged glances. Some unspoken communication passed between them. "We'll need to verify the information you've provided," Michael Torres said. "The billing, irregularities, the client testimonials, your track record. This isn't a decision we can make today." "I understand," Andrea said. "Take all the time you need. But while you're deciding, ask yourself this. Who's been making this company actually work? Whose departure created the decline you're seeing, and who has the knowledge and relationships to turn it around?" She gathered her materials, feeling simultaneously exhausted and electrified. Vivian squeezed her shoulder as they prepared to leave. "One more thing," Susan Hammond said. "Ms. Campbell, regardless of what we decide about the acquisition, I want you to know that was one of the most impressive presentations I've seen in my 30 years practicing law. You commanded this room. Don't let anyone tell you you're not ready to lead." Andrea felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Outside the building, Andrea's legs felt weak. Vivian caught her arm, steadying her. "You did it," Vivian said. "You walked in there and claimed your power. Do you know how rare that is? How brave?" "I feel like I'm going to throw up," Andrea admitted. Patricia laughed. "That's normal. I threw up before my first board presentation as CFO. Fear and courage feel the same in your body. The difference is what you do with the feeling." They went to a bar nearby, ordered drinks they didn't really want, and replayed the meeting in whispers and exclamations. Andrea sat in the center of these accomplished women and felt for the first time like she belonged in their company. "What do you think will happen?" Andrea asked. "I think," Helen said slowly, "that you just change their understanding of who you are. Whether they approve the acquisition or not, you're no longer invisible, and that changes everything." Andrea's phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "How did it go?" "I'll tell you everything tonight," Andrea typed back, "but I think I just stopped apologizing for existing." Over the next week, the board conducted their due diligence. They verified Andrea's claims about client relationships and discovered that 4 major clients had been quietly dissatisfied for months. They reviewed the billing irregularities and found the pattern was exactly as Andrea had documented. They interviewed staff members who, when promised anonymity, told stories of Andrea's mentorship, problem-solving, and strategic insights. Brett and Doug, meanwhile, were scrambling. Brett hired an attorney, threatened to sue for defamation, made angry calls to board members. Doug took a different approach, reaching out to Andrea directly. They met at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory. Doug looked older than Andrea remembered, tired in a way that suggested he'd been confronting uncomfortable truths. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "For 19 years, I benefited from your work without acknowledging it. I told myself you were happy in your role, that you preferred supporting to leading. But that was convenient, wasn't it? It meant I didn't have to share credit or opportunity." Andrea studied him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because watching you walk into that board meeting made me realize something. I've spent my entire career coasting on my grandfather's reputation and other people's competence. I've never actually built anything myself. And now I'm 52 years old, watching someone I dismissed as a secretary prepare to buy the company my grandfather founded, and I have to ask myself, who actually deserves to run it?" "What about Brett?" Andrea asked. Doug's expression hardened. "Brett's been cheating the company for years. I knew things weren't quite right, but I looked the other way because confronting it meant acknowledging I wasn't really in control. That's on me. If your acquisition goes through, he's going to face consequences. He deserves them." "And you?" Andrea asked. "What do you want?" Doug was quiet for a long moment. "I want to be part of something real. I want to actually contribute instead of just occupying space. If you take over and if you're willing, I'd like to stay on in a genuine capacity, not as a favor, but because I think I could learn from you if you'll let me." Andrea hadn't expected this. She'd prepared for Doug's opposition, not his surrender, not his humility. "I'll consider it," she said carefully, "but things would be different. You'd report to me. You'd earn your position through performance, not legacy, and you'd have to accept that the woman you fired is now your boss." "I understand," Doug said. "And Andrea? For what it's worth, I'm sorry. You deserved better. For a long time." After he left, Andrea sat alone with her cooling coffee and thought about the strange shape forgiveness takes. She wasn't ready to trust Doug completely, but she appreciated the acknowledgement. It was more than Brett would ever offer. 10 days after the board meeting, Margaret called. "They're ready to talk terms." Andrea's heart leaped. "They're approving the acquisition. They want to negotiate structure. It's not approval yet, but it's not rejection either. They want another meeting, this time to discuss specifics. Price, timeline, transition plan. Can you be ready by Friday?" "Yes," Andrea said without hesitation. The next 3 days were intense preparation. Andrea and her investor team worked with Margaret to develop detailed acquisition terms, transition plans, and financial projections. They outlined exactly how leadership would change, which clients would be prioritized, and how staff would be supported through the transition. Andrea barely slept, running on adrenaline and purpose. Emma stayed with her those nights, making sure her mother ate and occasionally slept, serving as both cheerleader and reality check. "Mom, what if they say no?" Emma asked Thursday night. Andrea looked at her daughter. "Then I take my consulting clients, build my own firm, and prove I didn't need their company to be successful. Either way, I'm not going back to being invisible." Friday's meeting was smaller, just the board members, Andrea, Vivian, and Margaret. Brett and Doug had been excluded from negotiations, a sign that the board was taking Andrea's concerns seriously. The discussion was technical, focused on valuation and terms. Andrea held firm on her price, fair market value based on current performance, not inflated past reputation. She held firm on her role as CEO. She held firm on operational control. At one point, James Chen said, "Ms. Campbell, you negotiate like you've done this before." Andrea smiled. "I've been negotiating my entire career, Mr. Chen. I just wasn't negotiating for myself before." After 4 hours, Michael Torres stood and extended his hand. "Ms. Campbell, subject to final legal review and shareholder approval, we're prepared to accept your offer. Welcome to the executive suite. Officially, this time. Andrea shook his hand, her grip firm despite the trembling in her fingers. Thank you for seeing what was always there. The paperwork took another 2 weeks to finalize. During that time, news of the acquisition spread through the industry like wildfire. Reactions were mixed. Some celebrated it as a triumph of merit over pedigree. Others dismissed it as a fluke, a quirk. Andrea learned to stop reading the comments. Brett Matthews resigned before he could be fired, taking a position at a smaller firm with a significant pay cut. He didn't say goodbye to Andrea. She didn't expect him to. Doug stayed on, true to his word, accepting a restructured role that reflected his actual value rather than his legacy. Andrea watched him carefully, waiting for resentment to surface. But he seemed genuinely committed to proving himself. On Andrea's first official day as CEO, exactly 6 weeks after being fired, she arrived at 7:15 out of habit, then laughed at herself and went to get coffee instead. She'd spent 19 years arriving early to serve others. Today, she could arrive at a reasonable hour. At 8:30, she walked into the building. The security guard looked up, startled to see her. "Miss Campbell, I heard..." "Congratulations, ma'am." "Ma'am." Not Andrea. Not invisible. "Ma'am." She took the elevator to the 32nd floor and walked through the office that used to be her entire world. Staff members looked up, some with curiosity, some with wariness, some with hope. Patty Rodriguez was waiting at what used to be Andrea's desk, tears in her eyes. Director of Operations reporting for duty, boss. They hugged, two women who'd been invisible together and were now visible as leaders. Andrea walked into the corner office, the office that had been Brett's, then Doug's, and now was hers. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago, a desk that felt absurdly large, space that seemed to echo with the weight of responsibility. She set down her bag and looked at the empty walls. Tomorrow, she'd bring in the photo of Emma. She'd bring in her coffee mug with the faded gold rim. She'd bring in her notebooks filled with 19 years of observations. She'd make this space her own. But today, she just stood at the window and looked at the city stretched out below her. Somewhere down there, her younger self was arriving at work early, making coffee for men who didn't say thank you, believing that being valuable where you were was enough. Andrea pressed her hand against the cool glass and sent a message to that younger woman. It's not enough. You deserve more. And one day, you'll be brave enough to take it. Andrea just stood up to the men who dismissed her for 19 years. If you're cheering for her right now, hit that like button. And if you want to see what happens next, stay with us. Because the real transformation is just beginning. The first week as CEO was chaos. Andrea called an all-staff meeting on her second day to address the transition directly. "I know many of you are wondering what this change means," she said, standing in the main conference room where she'd sat silent for so many years. "Some of you knew me as Andrea the assistant. Now I'm Andrea the CEO. That's confusing. But here's what hasn't changed. I care about doing excellent work. I care about treating people with respect, and I care about building a company where talent is recognized, not just credentials." She paused, looking at faces that ranged from supportive to skeptical. "Here's what is changing. We're going to operate with transparency. We're going to promote based on performance. We're going to value everyone's contributions, regardless of their title. And we're going to rebuild trust with our clients by actually being worthy of that trust." Carolyn Bennett raised her hand. "Ms. Campbell, I owe you an apology. I dismissed you when you tried to help me. I said I didn't need secretary advice. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Andrea nodded, appreciating the public acknowledgement. "Thank you, Carolyn. And I forgive you. We all carry biases we're not aware of until we confront them. What matters is what we do once we know better." After the meeting, staff members approached Andrea with a mixture of congratulations and concerns. Some were genuinely excited about the change. Others were worried about their positions. Andrea spent hours that day in one-on-one conversations, listening and reassuring and setting expectations. The hardest conversation was with a senior consultant named Marcus, who'd been at the firm almost as long as Andrea. "I'll be honest," he said, leaning against the doorframe of her office. "I'm having trouble with this, not because you're a woman, or maybe partly that, I don't know, but because you were an assistant. How do I take strategic direction from someone who used to schedule my meetings?" Andrea appreciated his honesty, even as it stung. "Marcus, I understand that's difficult, but think about every time I solved a problem you brought to me. Every time I connected you with a client contact. Every time I gave you insight about a project. Was that valuable?" "Of course it was." "Then the only thing that's changed is that now you know to value it. I've been providing strategic thinking for years. You just didn't recognize it because you were looking at my title instead of my contributions." Marcus was quiet, processing. "I guess I never thought about it that way." "Most people don't," Andrea said. "That's the problem. We're so trained to equate position with competence that we can't see expertise when it's in front of us. I'm asking you to look at my work, not my history. Can you do that?" "I can try," Marcus said. "That's honest, right?" "That's more than honest. That's actually respectful. Thank you." The client conversations were easier. Robert Fitzgerald was thrilled. "About time someone competent took over that place," he said over the phone. "I've already told 3 other companies to work with you." Sandra Morrison was more cautious, but willing. "Andrea, I trust you, but I need to see that the company culture has actually changed. Show me that this isn't just new leadership with the same old problems." "Give me 90 days, Andrea said. "Judge me on results, not promises." David Chen at Chen Pharmaceuticals laughed when she called. "I heard what happened. Good for you. Honestly, Andrea, I always wondered why you weren't running that place. You understood my business better than anyone there." By the end of the first week, Andrea was exhausted but exhilarated. She was learning that leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions and empowering people to find solutions together. Vivian stopped by her office Friday evening. "How are you holding up?" "I'm terrified," Andrea admitted. "Every decision feels enormous. What if I mess this up?" "You will mess things up," Vivian said matter-of-factly. "Everyone does. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. It's how you handle them when you do. That's what separates good leaders from bad ones." Andrea thought about Brett, who'd blamed everyone else for his failures, about Doug, who'd coasted on legacy instead of building competence, about all the leaders she'd watched over 19 years, who'd prioritized ego over effectiveness. "I want to be the kind of leader I wish I'd had," Andrea said. "Then be that," Vivian said simply. "It's not complicated. It's just hard." The second week brought the first real crisis. A project that Brett had been managing, poorly, Andrea discovered, was failing catastrophically. The client was threatening to pull their entire contract, which would mean losing $200,000 in annual revenue. Andrea could have blamed Brett, who was no longer there to defend himself. It would have been easy and probably justified. But that wasn't the kind of leader she wanted to be. Instead, she called the client directly. "Mr. Peterson, this is Andrea Campbell. I understand. We've let you down on the Henderson project. I take full responsibility for that failure, but I'd like the opportunity to fix it if you're willing to give us a chance." "You're the new CEO?" Peterson said, surprised. "The secretary." Andrea had to bite back her automatic defensiveness. "I was the executive assistant, yes. Now I'm the CEO, and I know this project intimately because I helped develop the initial proposal. I know where we went wrong, and I know how to correct it. Will you give me 2 weeks to turn this around?" "Why should I?" Peterson asked, but he sounded more curious than hostile. "Because I'm not going to make promises I can't keep or blame other people for failures. I'm going to tell you exactly what went wrong, show you exactly how we'll fix it, and then actually do the work. No excuses, just results." Peterson was quiet. "All right, 2 weeks. But Andrea..." I'm trusting you personally on this. Don't make me regret it." Andrea assembled a team to rescue the Henderson project. Patty to manage operations, Carolyn to handle client communications, Marcus to oversee the technical work. She worked alongside them, not above them, pulling late nights and weekend hours to meet the deadline. On day 13, they delivered the corrected project. It was better than anything Brett had ever produced. More thorough, more innovative, actually addressing the client's needs instead of just checking boxes. Peterson called the next day. "I'm impressed. This is what we should have had from the beginning. You've earned another year on our contract." Andrea wanted to cry with relief. Instead, she thanked him professionally and then gathered her team. "We did this together," she told them. "This win belongs to all of us, and that's how we're going to operate going forward, as a team where everyone's contribution matters." The win rippled through the company. Staff members who'd been skeptical saw that Andrea wasn't just talk. She was willing to work alongside them, to claim responsibility rather than credit. Slowly, cautiously, the culture began to shift. Month 2 brought a board review. Andrea presented performance metrics, client retention stabilizing, new business development showing promise, staff satisfaction surveys improving. The numbers were modest but moving in the right direction. "You've made progress," Michael Torres acknowledged, "but we need to see sustained improvement." The company's reputation took a hit during the transition. Some clients are still skeptical. Chapter 4. Andrea nodded, accepting the feedback. "I understand. That's why I'm proposing something different. Instead of just telling clients we've changed, I want to show them. I'm organizing a client summit where we'll present our new strategic direction and invite honest feedback. Transparency over spin." Susan Hammond raised an eyebrow. "That's risky. What if clients use it as a forum to air grievances publicly?" "Then we'll hear them and address them," Andrea said. "I'd rather deal with criticism directly than have it fester in private conversations." The board approved the summit, and Andrea spent the next month planning it with her team. It would be held at a downtown hotel with presentations, workshops, and open forums for discussion. Risky, as Susan had said. But Andrea had learned that playing it safe was just another way of staying invisible. The night before the summit, Andrea couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through worst-case scenarios. What if clients stood up and denounced her leadership? What if this became a public disaster that destroyed everything she'd built? Her phone buzzed at 2 a.m. Emma, who'd inherited her mother's insomnia during stressful times. "You awake?" the text said. "Unfortunately," Andrea replied. "Want to talk?" Andrea called, and Emma answered immediately. "Mom, you're spiraling, I can tell." "What if tomorrow is a disaster?" Andrea asked. "What if it's a triumph?" Emma countered. "You've spent 2 months working yourself into the ground to turn that company around. You've built relationships with clients over 19 years. They trust you. Why are you doubting that now?" "Because I'm scared," Andrea admitted. "I'm scared that I'm not enough, that I'll never be enough, that everyone is waiting for me to fail so they can say they were right about me all along." "Mom, listen to me. You're enough. You've always been enough. The problem was never you. It was a system designed to make you doubt yourself. Don't let that system win, even after you've beaten it." Andrea felt tears slide down her temples into her hair. "When did you get so wise?" "I learned from watching you," Emma said. "Even when you didn't see your own strength, I saw it. Now it's time for you to see it too." The client summit opened at 9 a.m. with nearly 50 attendees, clients, board members, industry observers. Andrea stood at the podium, looking at faces that held curiosity, skepticism, and in some cases, open hostility. "Good morning," she said. "Thank you for being here. I know many of you are wondering about the changes at Pierce & Matthews. Some of you have concerns. Some of you are cautiously optimistic, and some of you are probably here just to see if I crash and burn." A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the room. "I'm not going to stand here and make promises about being a new kind of company," Andrea continued. I'm going to be honest with you. This company failed you. Under previous leadership, we prioritized appearances over substance, credentials over competence, and credit over actual client service. We took your business for granted, and many of you left because of it." She paused, looking at Robert Fitzgerald, Sandra Morrison, David Chen, clients who'd stayed despite the chaos. "What I'm proposing isn't radical, it's basic. We listen to you. We deliver what we promise. We treat you like partners, not revenue streams. We value the people who do the actual work, which means better service for you. That's it. No corporate buzzwords. Just competence, consistency, and respect." She opened the floor to questions, and the first one came from a client she didn't recognize. "Ms. Campbell, you were an administrative assistant. What makes you think you're qualified to run a consulting firm?" The question was exactly what Andrea had expected and dreaded. "Here's the truth," she said. "I don't have an MBA. I don't have years of executive experience on my resume. What I have is 19 years of running this company from behind the scenes while other people took credit. I have relationships with most of you in this room that go back years. I have institutional knowledge that no one else possesses, and I have something else. I've been underestimated my entire career, so I've learned to over-deliver." She looked directly at the questioner. "Judge me on results, not credentials. That's all I ask." Sandra Morrison stood up. "I'll answer that question. I've worked with Pearson Matthews for 12 years. In that time, I've dealt with 4 different account managers. All of them had impressive credentials. None of them understood my business the way Andrea does. She's the reason I stayed when others left. Credentials don't build relationships. People do." One by one, other clients stood to share similar experiences. Robert Fitzgerald talked about how Andrea had solved a logistics crisis that their account manager hadn't even identified. David Chen described how Andrea's insights had shaped their entire strategic approach. Not everyone was convinced. A few clients remained skeptical. But by the end of the day, the dominant narrative had shifted from, "Can she do this?" to "Let's see what she can do." The summit became a turning point. Within 2 weeks, Andrea had secured commitments from 3 clients who'd been on the fence about renewing contracts. One client who'd left came back, specifically citing the transparency and competence displayed at the summit. But success brought new challenges. With stability came visibility, and with visibility came scrutiny. Andrea found herself featured in business publications, sometimes celebrated as a trailblazer, sometimes dismissed as a novelty. One particularly vicious article called her the secretary who lucked into the corner office. She read that article in her office late one evening, and it cut deeper than she wanted to admit. Emma found her there, still staring at the screen. "Stop reading that garbage," Emma said, closing the laptop. "They're not entirely wrong," Andrea said quietly. "Maybe I did just get lucky. Maybe—" "Stop," Emma interrupted firmly. "You're not lucky. You're competent. There's a difference. Lucky would be if you bought a lottery ticket and won. You identified an opportunity, assembled resources, negotiated terms, and then executed a turnaround. That's not luck. That's strategy." Andrea knew her daughter was right, but years of conditioning didn't evaporate overnight. The voice that said she wasn't enough was quieter now, but it was still there. Month 3 brought the opportunity Andrea had been hoping for. Henderson Global, a Fortune 500 company, requested a proposal for a major consulting project. It was exactly the kind of high-profile client that could establish Pearson Matthews as a serious firm again. Andrea assembled her team to develop the pitch. Doug attended the planning meetings, and to Andrea's surprise, he was genuinely helpful, offering insights about Henderson's corporate culture and potential pitfalls. "You've done your homework," Andrea told him after one meeting. Doug smiled wryly. "Turns out, when you actually have to earn your position, you pay more attention. Who knew?" The Henderson pitch was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. Andrea worked with Vivian to develop a presentation that showcased not just what they would do for Henderson, but how their approach differed from competitors. The night before, Andrea practiced in front of her bathroom mirror. She'd done this for the board presentation, for the client summit, for every high-stakes moment of the past 3 months. She was getting better at managing her nerves, at trusting her own competence. The Henderson Global boardroom was intimidating, all glass and chrome and powerful men in expensive suits. The executive team was led by Richard Henderson himself, third-generation CEO, with the kind of inherited confidence Andrea would never possess. Andrea walked in wearing her best suit, Vivian beside her, feeling every year of her 52 years and every moment of her 19 years as someone else's assistant. "Miss Campbell," Richard Henderson said, shaking her hand with a grip that was just shy of aggressive, "I've heard interesting things about Pierce and Matthews' new leadership. Shall we see what you've got?" Andrea set up her presentation, aware of the skeptical faces around the table. She recognized the look, the same look Brett used to give her when she tried to contribute to strategy meetings, the look that said, "Prove you belong here." So she did. "Henderson Global is at an inflection point," Andrea began. "You've grown through acquisition, but integration has been inconsistent. Your regional offices operate like separate companies, which creates inefficiencies and missed opportunities. You need operational consistency without losing local agility." She clicked through slides showing their analysis of Henderson's structure, their proposed solutions, their timeline. But more importantly, she told stories, specific examples of how they'd solved similar problems for other clients, what had worked and what hadn't. 15 minutes into her presentation, Richard Henderson interrupted. "Ms. Campbell, I appreciate the analysis, but I have to ask, you're relatively new as CEO. Why should we trust Pierce and Matthews with a project this significant?" Andrea had prepared for this question, but the answer came from somewhere deeper than preparation. "Mr. Henderson, you inherited this company from your grandfather. That's not a criticism. It's a fact. You had to prove you deserved the position you inherited. I imagine that was challenging." Henderson's expression shifted slightly, acknowledgement flickering in his eyes. "I didn't inherit my position," Andrea continued. "I earned it by doing the work for 19 years while other people took credit. I understand your operations better than consultants who'll throw expensive theories at you. I know the difference between what sounds good in a presentation and what actually works in practice. And I'm hungry in a way that established firms aren't because I have something to prove." She leaned forward slightly. "You want consultants who'll tell you what you want to hear? Hire someone else. You want consultants who'll tell you what you need to hear and then help you implement it? That's us. Your choice." The room was silent. Then Richard Henderson smiled, a real smile, not the corporate version. "I like you, Miss Campbell. You've got spine. Not everyone walks in here and challenges me. Let me discuss this with my team. We'll be in touch." Andrea walked out not knowing if she'd won the contract or destroyed her chances. But she knew she'd represented herself honestly. That felt like victory enough. 4 days later, Henderson Global awarded them the contract. It was the largest single deal in Pierce and Matthews' history, a $1 million engagement over 18 months. Andrea announced it at a company-wide meeting, and the applause was genuine, enthusiastic. Staff members who'd been skeptical now looked at her with respect. She'd proven she could not just maintain the company, but grow it. But the win also brought new pressure. The Henderson project would require significant resources, long hours, and flawless execution. One mistake could destroy everything she'd built. Andrea found herself working 70-hour weeks again, the same grinding exhaustion she'd sworn to avoid. One night, Vivian found her in the office at 10 p.m., surrounded by project documents. "You're doing it again," Vivian said. "Doing what?" "Trying to do everything yourself, trying to prove you're worthy by working yourself to death. Andrea, you already proved yourself. You won the contract. Now lead the team executing it. That's what CEOs do." Andrea looked at the documents covering her desk. What if they mess it up? What if I delegate and it falls apart? Then you course correct, Vivian said firmly. But if you burn yourself out trying to do everything, the company definitely fails. You have to trust your team. You built a good team. Trust them. It was one of the hardest things Andrea had learned to do, letting go, trusting others to handle responsibilities she'd carried alone for so long. But slowly, with Vivian's coaching and her own growing confidence, she learned. She delegated the Henderson project to a team led by Marcus, the consultant who'd initially struggled with reporting to her. She met with him weekly for updates but resisted the urge to micromanage. Marcus rose to the challenge. 3 months into the Henderson engagement, he presented at a status meeting with impressive results, ahead of schedule, under budget, and with enthusiastic feedback from the client. "You did excellent work," Andrea told him afterward. Marcus looked uncomfortable. "Can I be honest about something?" "Always. When you first became CEO, I didn't think you could do this. I thought the board made a mistake. But watching you lead these past few months, the way you've handled pressure, made tough calls, built this team, I was wrong. You're one of the best leaders I've worked for, and I'm sorry I doubted you." Andrea felt emotion tighten her throat. "Thank you for telling me, and thank you for giving me a chance to prove myself." "You didn't prove yourself to me," Marcus said. "You showed me what I'd been too blind to see. There's a difference." Month 6 brought Andrea's formal board review. She presented comprehensive metrics: revenue up 12%, client retention up to 93%, staff satisfaction scores improved by 40%. The Henderson Global Project was being held up as a case study in effective consulting. Michael Torres studied the numbers. "Ms. Campbell, when we approved your acquisition, I had doubts. I supported you because the alternative was worse. But I wasn't confident you could pull this off. I was wrong. You've not only stabilized the company, you've transformed it." Susan Hammond added, "The culture shift is remarkable. We're receiving unsolicited positive feedback from clients and staff. People feel valued in a way they haven't before." James Chen leaned back in his chair. "The question now isn't whether you can run this company. It's where you take it from here. What's your vision for year 2? Andrea had prepared for this. She pulled up a presentation showing expansion plans, new service offerings, and a leadership development program designed to identify and promote talent from within. "I want to build a company that's known not just for excellent client service, but for developing people," Andrea said. "I want us to be the place where administrative assistants can become consultants, where talent is recognized regardless of credentials, where people don't have to wait 19 years to be seen." She paused, looking at each board member. "I want to build the company I wish had existed when I was 25, the company that sees potential instead of just pedigree." The board approved her vision unanimously. That evening, Andrea invited her core team to dinner: Vivian, Patty, Doug, Margaret, and the investors who'd believed in her. They gathered at an upscale restaurant downtown, celebrating not just success, but the journey that had led to it. "I want to thank you all," Andrea said, raising her glass. 6 months ago, I was unemployed and terrified. You didn't just invest money, you invested belief. You gave me the foundation to build on. This success is ours, not just mine." Vivian smiled. "Andrea, we provided capital and advice. You provided courage. Don't diminish that." Patty squeezed Andrea's hand. "You changed my life. I was going to be an administrative assistant forever, accepting that was just how things were. Now I'm director of operations, leading projects, building a career. You didn't just save yourself. You saved me, too." Doug spoke up, and everyone turned to him in surprise. "I need to say something. Andrea, I was part of the system that held you back. I benefited from your invisibility. Working for you these past 6 months has been humbling. You've shown me what real leadership looks like. Not ego, not entitlement, but service and competence. You've made me a better professional and a better person. Thank you for giving me a second chance when I didn't deserve it." Andrea felt tears threaten, but held them back. We all deserve second chances, Doug. That's the point. The dinner lasted until midnight, filled with laughter and stories and the warm contentment of shared triumph. As Andrea drove home through Chicago's late-night streets, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed in less than a year. She'd gone from invisible to unavoidable, from dismissed to CEO, from accepting crumbs to demanding the whole meal. The journey had been terrifying and exhilarating and transformative in ways she was still processing. But more than the title or the success or the vindication, what mattered was this: she'd finally learned her own worth. And once you knew your worth, no one could take it away. Andrea went from dismissed secretary to empowered CEO, not through luck, but through courage, strategy, and refusing to accept being invisible. But the real battle is just beginning. If you're invested in this journey, drop a comment telling me what you would do in her position. And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. The next 6 months weren't without challenges. In month 7, a competitor tried to poach 3 of Andrea's top consultants by offering significant salary increases. Instead of matching the offers blindly, Andrea sat down with each person individually. "Tell me honestly what you need," she said. "Money, yes, but what else? More interesting projects? Leadership opportunities? Work-life balance?" She listened, really listened, and crafted individual retention packages that addressed each person's actual priorities. 2 of the 3 chose to stay, not because of salary, but because they felt valued as people, not just employees. The one who left did so amicably, and Andrea made sure to maintain the relationship. 6 months later, he returned saying, "The grass wasn't greener. It was just different grass with the same old weeds." In month 8, Andrea made her first major strategic mistake. She approved a new service, offering without adequate market research, excited by the potential but not properly evaluating the risks. The launch was a disaster. No client interest, wasted resources, embarrassment. At the emergency board meeting called to address the failure, Andrea did something Brett never would have done. She took full responsibility. "This was my mistake," she said. "I got caught up in enthusiasm without proper due diligence. I've learned from it, and here's what we're doing to prevent similar failures going forward." She outlined new processes for vetting strategic initiatives, better checks and balances, and a more rigorous approval system. Michael Torres nodded approvingly. "You're learning that leadership isn't about never making mistakes. It's about how you respond when you do. This is exactly how it should be handled." In month 9, Brett Matthews' attorney contacted Andrea. Brett was suing for wrongful termination and defamation, claiming Andrea had fabricated evidence about his billing irregularities to steal his job. Margaret handled most of the legal response, but Andrea had to give a deposition. Hours of answering questions designed to make her look vindictive, opportunistic, or incompetent. "Isn't it true that you resented Mr. Matthews for years?" the attorney asked. "No," Andrea said calmly. "I was frustrated by a system that undervalued my contributions. But my acquisition wasn't about Brett. It was about me finally valuing myself. You documented his billing discrepancies for months before using them against him. That sounds like a vendetta." "I documented irregularities because that was my job, to maintain accurate records. When I needed evidence to support my acquisition proposal, those records existed. That's not a vendetta. That's documentation." The case eventually settled out of court, with Brett's claims dismissed as baseless. But the process was exhausting and demoralizing. Andrea spent weeks second-guessing herself, wondering if she'd been too harsh, too ambitious, too unwilling to just accept her place. Emma visited during that difficult time, found her mother staring out the window with a glass of wine. "You're doing that thing again," Emma said. "That thing where you question whether you deserve what you've earned." "I destroyed Brett's career," Andrea said quietly. "No," Emma said firmly. "Brett destroyed his own career by stealing from clients. You just stopped enabling him. There's a difference." But what if I could have handled it differently? What if... Mom, stop. You spent 19 years asking, what if I'm not good enough? Now you're successful and asking, what if I don't deserve it? When are you going to just accept that you're competent, you earned this, and you deserve to be where you are? Andrea looked at her daughter and realized Emma was right. She'd traded one form of self-doubt for another. The voice that said she wasn't enough had morphed into a voice that said she was too much, too ambitious, too harsh, too unwilling to stay small. Both voices served the same purpose, keeping her from fully claiming her power. You're right, Andrea said. I need to stop apologizing for taking up space. Yes, Emma said. You do. In month 10, Andrea received an invitation to speak at a women's leadership conference. The topic was Breaking Through, how to overcome systemic barriers to leadership. She almost declined. Public speaking still terrified her, and she wasn't sure she had wisdom worth sharing. But Vivian convinced her to accept. Your story matters, Vivian said. Not just for you, but for every woman who's been told she's not enough. Andrea prepared her speech carefully, working through draft after draft until she had something that felt honest and meaningful. The day of the conference, she stood backstage listening to the MC introduce her. Andrea Campbell, CEO of Pierce & Matthews Consulting, who went from executive assistant to owner in less than a year. The introduction made it sound so simple, so clean. It hadn't been simple. It had been messy and terrifying and filled with moments of doubt that still occasionally surfaced at 3 a.m. But Andrea walked onto that stage, looked at hundreds of women watching her with hope and skepticism and recognition, and told her story. She told them about being fired after 19 years, about overhearing Brett and Doug discussing her elimination like she was a budget line item, about the moment she decided to stop accepting what others decided she deserved and start claiming what she'd earned. She told them about the fear, the self-doubt, the voice that said she wasn't qualified. She told them about assembling her investor team, about the board presentation, about confronting Brett with evidence of his failures. But most importantly, she told them about learning to see herself clearly, not through the lens of people who benefited from her invisibility, but through her own honest assessment of her skills, experience, and value. For 19 years, I believed my role was to make other people successful, Andrea said. I believed that supporting others was my purpose, and when I was fired, I thought I'd lost my identity. But here's what I learned. I didn't lose anything. I was freed. Freed from a system that required me to be small. Freed from a role that limited me. Freed from believing that being underestimated was something I had to accept. She looked at the women in the audience, saw her younger self in their faces. You're not just anything, Andrea said. You're not just an assistant or just an associate or just whatever title someone gave you to minimize your contributions. You're the sum of your skills, your insights, your relationships, and your potential. And the moment you start seeing yourself that way, not waiting for others to see it first, but claiming it yourself, everything changes. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, women lined up to talk to her, to share their own stories of dismissal and underestimation and the slow, difficult journey toward self-advocacy. One woman, probably in her early 40s, waited until everyone else had left. Ms. Campbell, I'm an administrative assistant. I've been in the same role for 12 years. Everyone tells me I'm lucky to have job security, that I should be grateful. But I want more, and I'm tired of feeling guilty about that. Andrea recognized herself in this woman so clearly it hurt. Then take more, Andrea said. Document everything you do. Build your skills. Find your allies. And when you're ready, stop asking for permission, because no one is going to give you permission to outgrow the box they've put you in. You have to give yourself permission. The woman's eyes filled with tears. What if I fail? What if you succeed? Andrea countered. What if you're so much more capable than they've allowed you to be? What if the only thing holding you back is believing them when they tell you to be grateful for crumbs? She watched the woman walk away with new determination in her posture and felt the weight of responsibility that came with visibility. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. It was part of a larger narrative about women who refused to accept limits. Chapter 5. By month 11, Pearson Matthews had exceeded its annual revenue projections by 18%. Staff retention was the highest it had been in a decade. Client satisfaction scores were approaching industry-leading levels. The company that had been hemorrhaging value under Brett and Doug's leadership was now thriving. But Andrea's greatest challenge wasn't external, it was internal. She was still working too hard, still trying to prove something, still carrying the weight of 19 years of invisibility on her shoulders. It was Vivian who finally confronted her about it. "Andrea, you won. You bought the company. You turned it around. You proved everyone wrong. When are you going to stop running like someone's chasing you?" Andrea looked up from the spreadsheet she'd been reviewing at 8 p.m. on a Friday. "I'm not—" "Yes, you are," Vivian interrupted. "You're still operating like you have to justify your existence every single day. Like if you slow down for 1 second, someone will realize you don't belong here and take it all away." Andrea felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. "Old habits," she said quietly. "Or old wounds," Vivian said gently. "You've spent a year proving you can do this job. At some point, you need to just do it without constantly proving anything. Trust that you belong here, because you do." That weekend, Andrea did something radical. She didn't work. She turned off her email, ignored her phone, and spent 2 full days with Emma. They went to a museum, had long lunches, took walks along the lakeshore. Simple things Andrea hadn't made time for in over a year. "You seem different," Emma said as they sat on a bench watching boats on Lake Michigan. "Different how?" Andrea asked. "Lighter, like you're finally letting yourself breathe." Andrea realized Emma was right. She'd been holding her breath for a year, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to tell her this was all a mistake. But nothing was dropping. She'd built something real, something sustainable, something that would last beyond her constant vigilance. "I think I'm learning to trust myself," Andrea said. "Really trust myself, not just perform confidence." "About time," Emma said with a smile. "I've been trusting you my whole life. Glad you're finally catching up." In month 12, Andrea made a decision that felt like the final piece of her transformation. She announced a company-wide initiative called Hidden Leaders, a program designed to identify and develop talent in non-traditional roles. Administrative assistants, junior analysts, operations staff, anyone whose contributions were undervalued could apply for mentorship, training, and pathways to advancement. It was everything Andrea had wished existed when she was 25 and invisible. "This program is personal to me," Andrea said at the launch meeting. "I spent 19 years being told I was valuable where I was, which was code for not valuable enough to promote. This company will never again mistake someone's current position for their potential. We're going to actively look for the talent we've been overlooking, and we're going to build futures, not just fill positions." The response was overwhelming. 37 people applied in the first week. Andrea personally interviewed each one, seeing versions of her younger self in their hopeful faces. One applicant was a woman named Jennifer, a receptionist who'd been with the company for 6 years. "I have ideas about how we could improve client intake," Jennifer said nervously, "but I didn't think anyone would listen because I'm just—" "Don't," Andrea interrupted gently. "Don't minimize yourself. You're not just anything. Tell me your ideas." Jennifer did, and they were brilliant. Practical solutions to problems Andrea hadn't even identified. By the end of the conversation, Andrea had offered Jennifer a role on the operations team, with a pathway to project management. "Really?" Jennifer asked, tears in her eyes. "You'd really promote me?" "I'm not promoting you," Andrea said. "I'm recognizing what you already are. There's a difference. The Hidden Leaders program became one of Pierce and Matthews' defining features, attracting talent that wanted to work for a company that valued potential over pedigree. Industry publications wrote about it. Other companies tried to copy it, but they couldn't replicate the authenticity that came from a CEO who'd lived the experience. As Andrea's first-year anniversary approached, the board requested a comprehensive review. She prepared a presentation that covered not just financial metrics, but cultural transformation, client relationships, and long-term strategic vision. The night before the meeting, Andrea sat in her office, the corner office that used to be Brett's, that she'd made her own over the past year. She looked at the wall where she'd hung her 19 years of performance reviews, each one praising her while keeping her in place. Below those reviews, she'd added something new: the letter from the board officially naming her CEO, the acquisition agreement with her signature bold and clear, photos from the client summit, the Henderson Global Project celebration, the Hidden Leaders launch, a visual record of transformation, of claiming power, of refusing to stay small. Emma stopped by on her way home from work. She'd taken a job at a nonprofit downtown and was building her own career with confidence Andrea recognized and celebrated. "Big day tomorrow," Emma said, settling into one of Andrea's visitor chairs. "Just another board meeting," Andrea said with a smile. "Mom, it's your first-year review as CEO. That's huge." Andrea looked at her daughter and realized something. You know what? It is huge. And a year ago, I would have downplayed it, said it was no big deal, minimized my accomplishment because I was scared of seeming arrogant. But you're right, it is huge, and I did it, and I'm proud of that. Emma grinned. "Look at you, accepting praise without deflecting. Character growth." They laughed together, and Andrea felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. This wasn't the nervous excitement of new success. This was the solid satisfaction of earned achievement, of work that mattered, of a life that finally reflected her actual worth. The board meeting the next day was almost anticlimactic. Andrea presented her comprehensive review with confidence that was no longer performance. The numbers spoke for themselves. Revenue up 23%, client retention at 95%, staff satisfaction at all-time highs. But it was the culture metrics that Michael Torres focused on. "Andrea, what you've built here goes beyond financial performance. You've created an environment where people feel valued, where talent is recognized, where someone's current position doesn't determine their future. That's rare in our industry. That's transformative." Susan Hammond added, "I've served on dozens of boards in my career. I've never seen a turnaround this comprehensive. You didn't just save this company, you reimagined what it could be." James Chen smiled. "When we approved your acquisition, I voted yes because the alternative was worse. Today, I'd vote yes because what you've built is exceptional, not just for what you've done, but for how you've done it, with integrity, competence, and genuine care for people." Andrea felt emotion rise in her throat but didn't fight it anymore. Vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was humanity. "Thank you," she said. "This has been the hardest and most rewarding year of my life. I've learned that leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the right questions and trusting people to find solutions together. It's about seeing potential in unexpected places. It's about being willing to be imperfect in public while striving for excellence." She paused, thinking about the woman she'd been a year ago, terrified, dismissed, ready to accept a severance package and disappear. "A year ago, I was invisible," Andrea said, "not because I wasn't competent, but because the system I was in required me to be invisible for others to shine. This year has been about learning that I can shine without dimming anyone else, that leadership isn't a zero-sum game, that there's room for everyone to be seen." The board gave her a standing ovation, not because it was expected, but because it was earned. After the meeting, Andrea walked through the office she now led with confidence. Staff members greeted her warmly, not with the distant respect reserved for untouchable executives, but with the genuine appreciation of people who felt valued by their leadership. She stopped at Patty Rodriguez's office, Director of Operations, a title that reflected what Patty had always been capable of but had never been allowed to demonstrate. "How's the Henderson project going?" Andrea asked. "Ahead of schedule and under budget," Patty said with a satisfied smile. "The client is already talking about Phase 2. Andrea, I never thought I'd be leading projects like this. I thought I'd be an administrative assistant forever." "You were never just an administrative assistant," Andrea said. "You were always a strategic thinker who hadn't been given strategic opportunities. I just opened the door. You walked through it." Patty stood and hugged her. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for letting yourself be seen," Andrea replied. That evening, Andrea hosted a celebration dinner for her core team and closest allies: Vivian, Patty, Doug, Margaret, the investors who'd believed in her, and Emma. They gathered at the same restaurant where they'd celebrated 6 months earlier, but the mood was different now. Less relief, more satisfaction, less proving, more being. "I want to say something," Andrea said, standing with her wine glass. "A year ago, I thought being fired was the worst thing that could happen to me. I thought I'd lost everything. But what I actually lost was a system that required me to be less than I was. What I gained was the courage to be exactly who I am." She looked at each person around the table. "You all played a role in that. Vivian, you invested in me when I barely believed in myself. Margaret, you gave me the legal foundation to build on. Patricia, Helen, Ruth, you showed me what women supporting women looks like. Patty, you reminded me I wasn't alone. Doug, you showed me that people can change when given the chance. Emma, you never let me settle for less than I deserved." Her voice caught with emotion. "I'm not the same woman who walked out of here with a cardboard box a year ago. I'm stronger, yes. But more importantly, I'm more myself, more authentic, more willing to take up space, more convinced that being underestimated doesn't have to be permanent." She raised her glass. "To transformation, to courage, to refusing to stay invisible." They drank together, and Andrea felt a peace she'd never experienced before. Not the peace of having arrived, but the peace of knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The dinner lasted until late, filled with laughter and reminiscence and plans for the future. As the evening wound down, Doug approached Andrea privately. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Working for you this year has been humbling. You've been a better leader than I ever was, and you've done it with grace I didn't show when I had power. You gave me a second chance when you could have destroyed me. That's the mark of real leadership." "Doug, we all deserve chances to grow," Andrea said. "You took yours seriously. That's all that matters." "I'm stepping down," Doug said, and Andrea's eyes widened in surprise. "Not because I'm unhappy, because I've realized something. This company is yours. Your vision, your values, your leadership. I've spent a year learning from you, and now it's time for me to build something of my own, something I earned from the ground up the way you did." Andrea felt a mixture of emotions: surprise, respect, and genuine pride in his growth. "What will you do?" "Start small. Maybe consulting for companies that need operational overhauls. Maybe mentorship for executives who need to unlearn bad habits. I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to do it without my grandfather's name propping me up. I'm going to do it as Doug Pierce, not as a legacy." "I'm proud of you," Andrea said, and meant it. "I learned from the best," Doug replied with a smile. 3 days later, Andrea stood in front of the company at an all-hands meeting to announce Doug's departure and her vision for year 2. "Change is constant," she told the assembled staff. "Doug is moving on to build something new, and I'm grateful for his contributions this year. We'll be restructuring the leadership team, and I'm committed to promoting from within. Several of you will have opportunities you might not have imagined a year ago." She looked at Jennifer, the former receptionist who was now excelling on the operations team, at Marcus, who'd become one of her most trusted senior consultants, at Carolyn Bennett, who'd learned to lead with authenticity instead of competition. "This company succeeds because you're seen," Andrea said, "because your contributions matter, because we've built a culture where potential is recognized and developed, not overlooked. That's our competitive advantage. That's who we are." The applause was genuine and sustained. After the meeting, Andrea returned to her office and found a package on her desk. Inside was a framed photo from the Hidden Leaders program launch, showing Andrea surrounded by participants. Below the photo, an engraved plaque read, "To the leader who taught us to see ourselves clearly. With gratitude, the Hidden Leaders." Andrea traced the words with her fingers, feeling the weight of responsibility and privilege that came with visibility. Her story had become part of something larger, a movement of women who refused to accept being underestimated, who claimed their worth, who led with authenticity instead of performance. She thought about the young woman at the leadership conference who'd asked about failing, about Jennifer, who'd been a receptionist until someone saw her potential, about Patty, who'd spent 8 years in accounting before being recognized as a strategic leader, about all the women who were still invisible, still waiting, still wondering if they deserved more. Andrea opened her laptop and began writing. Not a business document, but something personal. A letter to her younger self, to every woman who'd been dismissed, to everyone who'd been told they were just something. "Dear invisible woman," she wrote, "I see you. I know you're working harder than anyone realizes, solving problems no one acknowledges, building foundations others take credit for. I know you've been told to be grateful, to be patient, to wait your turn. I know you've internalized the message that supporting others is your purpose, that taking up space is selfish, that demanding recognition is arrogant. But here's what I've learned. You're not selfish for wanting more. You're not arrogant for knowing your worth. You're not ungrateful for refusing to accept crumbs when you've been baking the whole meal. The day I was fired, I thought I'd lost everything. But what I lost was a story other people had written about who I was allowed to be. What I found was the courage to write my own story. And that story didn't start with credentials or connections or courage. It started with anger, righteous, justified anger at being dismissed, at being told I was valuable where I was, which meant not valuable enough for more. So here's my advice. Get angry. Not bitter, but angry. Channel that anger into action. Document everything. Build your skills. Find your allies. And when you're ready, when you're so tired of being small that staying invisible feels worse than the risk of being seen, take your shot. You might fail. You might succeed. But either way, you'll know you tried. You'll know you valued yourself enough to fight for what you deserved. And that knowledge, that you were brave enough to claim your worth, that's what changes everything. You're not just anything. You're everything you need to be. You just need to believe it, and then act like you believe it, and then keep acting like you believe it until it becomes so true that no one, including you, can deny it anymore. With respect and recognition, someone who was invisible and chose to be seen. Andrea saved the letter, planning to share it at her next speaking engagement. But more than that, she saved it as a reminder to herself, a reminder of how far she'd come and how many others were still on the journey she'd walked. 6 months later, 18 months after being fired, Andrea sat in her office on a quiet Sunday afternoon reviewing the company's performance. Revenue had doubled from when she took over. Staff retention was industry-leading. Client satisfaction was at an all-time high. The Hidden Leaders program had promoted 12 people from administrative or entry-level roles into professional positions. But the metrics that meant the most to Andrea weren't on any spreadsheet. They were in the messages she received from women who'd heard her speak or read about her journey. Messages that said, "You gave me courage. I quit the job that was killing me. I started my own business. I demanded a promotion and got it. I stopped apologizing for being competent. Her story had become permission for others to write their own stories. That felt like success in ways profit margins never could. Emma stopped by, as she often did on weekends, bringing coffee and conversation. "Mom, I'm proud of you," Emma said, settling into the chair across from Andrea's desk. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become. You're happier, more yourself. You take up space without apologizing." "I'm still learning," Andrea admitted. "There are still days when I doubt myself, when the old voice says I'm not enough. But those days are rarer now, and when they come, I know how to quiet that voice. I remind myself of what I've built, who I've helped, what I've earned." "That's growth," Emma said, not eliminating doubt, but learning to act despite it. Andrea thought about the woman she'd been a year and a half ago, packing a cardboard box, feeling like her life was ending, believing she'd lost her identity along with her job. That woman would barely recognize the person Andrea had become, not because she'd changed fundamentally, but because she'd finally allowed herself to be fully who she'd always been: competent, strategic, worthy of leadership, no longer performing smallness to make others comfortable. "You know what I've learned?" Andrea said. "Being underestimated isn't a permanent condition. It's a choice. Their choice to underestimate, your choice to accept it or challenge it. For 19 years, I chose to accept it because challenging it felt dangerous. But you know what's more dangerous? Spending your entire life being less than you are." Emma smiled. "I'm glad you finally figured that out." "Me too," Andrea said. "Me too." That evening, Andrea did something she'd been planning for months. She drove to her old neighborhood, parked outside the apartment building where she'd lived when she first started at Pierce & Matthews as a 23-year-old receptionist. She sat in her car, looking at the building's familiar facade, and thought about that young woman. Fresh from a failed first, marriage, no college degree, desperate for stability and terrified of asking for too much. That woman had taken a job as a receptionist thinking it was temporary, a stepping stone to something better. 19 years later, she'd been fired from that same company, having never moved beyond supporting others. But now she owned it, led it, transformed it. Andrea pulled out her phone and called that number she'd been given at the leadership conference, the woman who'd been an administrative assistant for 12 years and wanted more. "Hello?" The woman answered, surprise in her voice. "Hi, this is Andrea Campbell. We met at the leadership conference. You asked me about making a change. I wanted to check in. How are you doing?" There was a pause, then emotion in the woman's voice. "Ms. Campbell, I can't believe you called. I actually did it. I applied for a management position at my company. They said I wasn't qualified, but I showed them documentation of all the strategic work I'd been doing without credit. They created a position for me. I start next month." Andrea felt tears prick her eyes. "That's incredible. I'm so proud of you." "I wouldn't have done it without hearing your story," the woman said. "You gave me permission to stop accepting less than I deserved. Thank you." After they hung up, Andrea sat in her car and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that her pain, all those years of being dismissed and diminished, had meaning beyond her own story. It had become a bridge for others to cross. She thought about her father, who died believing that hard work would be rewarded if you just kept your head down, about her ex-husband, who told her she was born to support, not lead, about Brett and Doug, who'd fired her thinking she was replaceable. They'd all been wrong. Not because hard work didn't matter, it did, but because being seen required more than just working hard. It required claiming your worth, demanding recognition, refusing to accept that being underestimated was just how things were. Andrea drove home through Chicago's evening streets, watching lights come on in apartment windows, lives being lived, stories being written. She thought about all the women in those apartments who were invisible in their own lives, who were supporting others while their own dreams deferred. She made a decision. Tomorrow, she'd start working on her book in earnest, the memoir and practical guide she'd been outlining for months. From secretary to CEO, reclaiming your voice. She'd tell her story not as inspiration porn, but as a roadmap, practical steps, hard truths, real strategies for women who were done waiting for permission. The next morning, Andrea woke at 6 a.m., not from anxiety, but from excitement. She had her coffee, went for a run along the lakeshore, and then settled at her kitchen table with her laptop. She typed the opening line of her book. I spent 19 years being invisible before I learned. That visibility was a choice. The words flowed like a river that had been dammed too long. She wrote about the small dismissals that accumulated over years, about the voice that said she wasn't enough, about the moment she decided to stop accepting other people's stories about who she was allowed to be. She wrote for 3 hours straight, the story pouring out of her with urgency and clarity. When she finally stopped, she had 15 pages, raw, honest, sometimes painful, but true, completely true. Her phone rang. Vivian. I'm calling to remind you about the Industry Innovation Awards tonight, Vivian said. You haven't forgotten, right? Andrea had completely forgotten. The awards ceremony where Pearson Matthews was nominated for Company Transformation of the Year. Brett and Doug had submitted the company years ago before their departure, but the nomination had carried through. I'll be there, Andrea promised. That evening, Andrea dressed in a navy suit, elegant, professional, powerful without trying too hard. Emma met her at the venue, offering moral support and fashion approval. You look like a CEO, Emma said with a smile. I am a CEO, Andrea replied. And for the first time, it didn't feel strange to say. The ceremony was held in a downtown ballroom filled with industry leaders Andrea had once viewed as untouchable. Now she moved through the crowd with confidence, greeting peers, clients, competitors. She was no longer on the periphery looking in. She was part of the conversation. When the company transformation category was announced, Andrea felt her stomach clench. The nominees were read: major corporations with impressive turnaround stories, companies with recognizable names and substantial resources. And then, Pearson Matthews Consulting. Under new leadership from CEO Andrea Campbell, the company achieved a 120% revenue increase, 95% client retention, and industry-leading staff satisfaction. More significantly, Campbell implemented the Hidden Leaders program, transforming company culture and demonstrating that leadership can come from unexpected places. The video screen showed photos from her journey: the client summit, the Henderson Global contract signing, the Hidden Leaders launch, Andrea sitting at the head of the conference table, Andrea presenting to clients, Andrea as CEO, not assistant, and the award goes to Pearson Matthews Consulting and Andrea Campbell. The applause was thunderous. Andrea walked to the stage in a daze, Emma cheering loudly from their table, Vivian and Patty on their feet applauding. Andrea accepted the Crystal Award, heavy in her hands, and looked at the crowd of industry professionals. A year and a half ago, most of them wouldn't have known her name. Now they were applauding her transformation. Thank you, Andrea said into the microphone, her voice steady. This award isn't just for me. It's for every person who's been underestimated, overlooked, or told they weren't qualified. It's for the administrative assistants who run companies without getting credit, for the entry-level employees with strategic insights no one hears, for everyone who's been told they're valuable where they are, which is code for not valuable enough for more. She paused, emotion rising. 18 months ago, I was fired from the company I now lead. I was told my position was being eliminated, that the company was moving in a new direction. What they meant was, you're too old, too expensive, too limited by your title. They were wrong. Not because I was perfect, but because they were only seeing my title, not my contributions. This transformation wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. forcing a company to acknowledge competence it had been benefiting from without valuing. And more than that, it was about finally recognizing my own worth. Because that's where all transformation starts, not with others seeing you differently, with you refusing to be invisible anymore. She held up the award. To everyone watching who feels unseen, you're not. You're just in rooms full of people who are threatened by your potential. Find different rooms, build different rooms. And when you do, make sure the door stays open for others who are still waiting to be seen. The standing ovation lasted 2 full minutes. Afterward, dozens of people approached Andrea, some congratulating her, others sharing their own stories of being overlooked, a few offering business opportunities and partnerships. One woman, probably in her mid-50s, waited until everyone else had left before approaching. Ms. Campbell, I'm the Chief People Officer at Henderson Global, the company you're consulting for. I wanted to tell you something. When we first met with you, several executives dismissed you as unqualified. I was one of them. I'm ashamed of that now. Andrea looked at her with empathy. We all carry biases. Yes, but mine was particularly hypocritical, the woman continued. I spent 15 years as an executive assistant before transitioning into HR. I should have recognized your competence immediately. Instead, I saw your title and made assumptions. Watching you work this past year, seeing what you've built, it's made me realize I've been complicit in undervaluing others the way I was once undervalued. I'm implementing a version of your Hidden Leaders program at Henderson. You've inspired real change. That's all any of us can ask for, Andrea said, to turn our pain into purpose, to use what we've learned to help others. As Andrea drove home that night, the award on her passenger seat catching streetlight, she thought about how strange and wonderful her life had become. She'd started as a receptionist, spent 19 years as an assistant, been fired at 52, and now at 53 was a CEO, an award winner, and an advocate for the invisible. The journey hadn't been linear or clean. It had been messy and terrifying and filled with moments where she'd almost given up, but she hadn't. She'd kept pushing forward, kept claiming space, kept refusing to accept that being dismissed was the end of her story. Emma was waiting at Andrea's apartment when she arrived, having used her key to let herself in. She'd ordered pizza and opened wine, ready to celebrate. To my mom, Emma said, raising her glass, who taught me that it's never too late to claim your power. To you, Andrea replied, who never let me forget I deserved more. They ate pizza and talked until midnight, mother and daughter, 2 women supporting each other across generations. Andrea looked at Emma, confident, unapologetic, taking up space without asking permission, and felt grateful. Her daughter would never spend 19 years being invisible. Andrea had made sure of that. The next morning was Monday, and Andrea arrived at the office at 8:30, still early, but no longer frantically early. She walked through the building with the easy confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Patty Rodriguez met her with coffee and a grin. I saw the awards ceremony video online. You're going viral, boss. Over 1 million views of your speech already. Andrea felt a flutter of panic. Public visibility still made her nervous, but she pushed through it. Being seen was the point. Using her platform to amplify other invisible voices was the whole point. Make sure to share it on the company's social media, Andrea said, with a link to the Hidden Leaders program information. If my story helps someone else, that's what matters. The day unfolded with the usual mix of meetings, decisions, and small crises that came with leadership. Andrea handled each with growing confidence, no longer second-guessing every choice, no longer performing competence instead of just being competent. At lunch, she met with 3 participants from the Hidden Leaders program to discuss their progress. All 3 were women who'd been in administrative roles, now transitioning into professional positions. Their excitement was palpable, their gratitude genuine. Ms. Campbell, you changed my life, one woman said. I was a receptionist for 8 years. I thought that's all I'd ever be. Now I'm training as a business analyst. I'm building a career, not just holding a job." "You were always capable of more," Andrea said. "The system just didn't recognize it. Now you're in a system that does." After they left, Andrea sat alone in her office and felt the weight of responsibility that came with transformation. She'd changed her own life, yes, but she'd also created a model that could change others' lives. That was both privilege and obligation. She opened her laptop and looked at the book manuscript she'd been working on. 50 pages now, growing every day. The story of her journey from invisible to unavoidable, told with honesty and practical guidance. She typed a new section, "The Ripple Effect of Visibility." When you claim your power, you don't just change your own life. You change the lives of everyone watching. Women who've been told they're not enough suddenly see evidence that they are. People who've accepted being underestimated realize they have a choice. Systems that benefit from invisibility are forced to acknowledge competence they've been exploiting. That's the real transformation, not just personal success, but systemic change. One visible woman creates permission for 10 others to be seen. Those 10 create permission for 100, and slowly, painfully, the culture shifts. Not because of policy or programs, though those help, but because of people who refuse to stay small. So if you're reading this and thinking about taking that risk, applying for that position, starting that business, demanding that promotion, know that you're not just changing your life. You're changing the world for everyone who comes after you. That's your legacy. That's your power. Use it. Andrea saved the document and felt a deep sense of rightness. This was her calling now, not just leading a company, but leading a movement, creating visibility for the invisible, claiming space for the dismissed, building systems that recognized potential instead of just credentials. 6 months later, 2 full years after being fired, Andrea's book, From Secretary to CEO, Reclaiming Your Voice, was published. It became an instant bestseller, resonating with women across industries who saw their own stories in Andrea's journey. She went on a book tour, speaking at corporate events, women's conferences, and leadership seminars. Everywhere she went, women approached her with their stories of being overlooked, dismissed, told they weren't qualified, and increasingly stories of fighting back, speaking up, claiming space. At one event, a young woman in her 20s approached Andrea. "Ms. Campbell, I'm graduating college next month. My professors keep telling me to start at the bottom and work my way up, to be patient and wait my turn. But your story makes me think maybe I should skip the waiting part and just go straight for what I want." Andrea smiled. "Start wherever you need to start. But don't confuse patience with accepting less than your worth. Be strategic. Document everything. Build skills. But never internalize the message that supporting others is your only value. You have strategic value from day one. Make sure you're compensated for it." "What if they say I'm too ambitious, too demanding?" "Then they're not your people," Andrea said simply. "Find people who celebrate your ambition instead of trying to dim it." The young woman left with new determination, and Andrea felt the generational shift happening. Women in their 20s weren't willing to wait 19 years like Andrea had. They were demanding recognition from the start, and that was exactly how it should be. Pierce & Matthews continued to thrive. By year 3, the company had expanded into new markets, doubled its staff, and become known industry-wide for its innovative culture and commitment to developing talent. But Andrea's proudest achievement wasn't the revenue or the expansion. It was the 37 people who'd gone through the Hidden Leaders program and now held professional positions. It was the company culture where administrative assistants contributed to strategy meetings. It was the fact that when someone at Pierce & Matthews said, "I have an idea," their title didn't determine whether anyone listened. On the 3rd anniversary of her firing, a date Andrea now celebrated rather than mourned, she gathered her team for a company-wide meeting. 3 years ago today, I was told my position was being eliminated, Andrea said, looking at the faces of people she now led. I thought my career was over. I thought I'd lost my identity. What I actually lost was a system that required me to be small. What I gained was the courage to be exactly who I am." She paused, emotion rising. "But this isn't just my story. It's our story. We've built something special here, a company where people are valued for their contributions, not their credentials, where potential is recognized and developed, where being underestimated doesn't have to be permanent. I'm grateful to every person in this room. You've made this transformation possible. You've proven that when you create systems that actually see people, amazing things happen. So thank you for your work, your trust, and your willingness to be part of something different." The applause was genuine and sustained. Andrea looked at Patty, now VP of Operations, at Jennifer, the former receptionist who was now managing major accounts, at Marcus, who'd become one of her most trusted advisors, at Carolyn Bennett, who'd learned to lift others up instead of competing with them. She thought about Brett Matthews, wherever he was, probably still blaming others for his failures, about Doug Pierce, who'd started his own consulting firm and was building something earned rather than inherited, about all the people who'd underestimated her over the years. They'd been wrong, not because Andrea was perfect or exceptional, but because they'd been looking at her title instead of her competence. They'd been so trained to equate position with value that they couldn't see expertise when it was organizing their calendars and solving their problems. That evening, Andrea sat in her office, earned not given, and reflected on the journey. The awards on her wall, the photos from company events, the thank you notes from Hidden Leaders Program participants, the book cover with her name in bold letters. But the thing that meant the most sat on her desk in a simple frame. It was a note from that young woman she'd met at the leadership conference 2 years ago, the administrative assistant who'd wanted more but been told to be grateful. "Dear Ms. Campbell," the note read, "I wanted you to know that I did it. I documented everything, built my case, and demanded a promotion. They said no. So I started my own consulting firm. I have 3 clients now and growing. You taught me that being underestimated is only permanent if you accept it. I stopped accepting it. Thank you for showing me what's possible. With gratitude and respect, Sarah." Andrea traced the words with her finger, feeling the weight and privilege of visibility. Her story had given someone else permission to write their own. That ripple effect, that was the real transformation. Her phone buzzed, Emma checking in as she did most evenings. "How was the anniversary celebration?" Emma asked. "Perfect," Andrea said. "Meaningful. I looked around that room and realized I'd helped build something that actually matters. Not just profit margins, but people's lives, futures, possibilities." "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Emma said. "Not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you've become. You're happy, really happy. I don't think I've ever seen you this content." Andrea realized Emma was right. She was happy. Not the anxious, performing happiness of someone trying to prove something, but the deep, solid happiness of someone living in alignment with their values, someone who'd claimed their worth and built a life that reflected it. "I spent 52 years trying to be enough for other people," Andrea said. "Now I'm just trying to be fully myself. Turns out that's more than enough." After they hung up, Andrea did something she hadn't done in years. She left the office at 5 p.m., not because there wasn't work to do, there was always work to do, but because she'd learned that her worth wasn't measured by hours worked or how much she sacrificed. Her worth was inherent. She could be an excellent CEO and still have a life. She drove home through Chicago's early evening traffic, the city lights beginning to glow against the darkening sky. She thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago, terrified, dismissed, packing her life into a cardboard box. That woman would barely recognize Andrea now, not because she'd become someone different, but because she'd finally become completely herself, unapologetic, visible, taking up space without asking permission. At home, Andrea changed into comfortable clothes, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat on her balcony overlooking the city. She opened her laptop and looked at the manuscript for her second book. This one focused on practical strategies for women navigating workplace inequality. She typed the opening paragraph. 3 years ago, I was fired from a job I'd held for 19 years. Best thing that ever happened to me. Not because being fired is good, but because it forced me to stop accepting a story others had written about my value. This book is about writing your own story. Andrea wrote for 2 hours, the words flowing with the ease of truth. She wrote about documentation, about building alliances, about knowing when to stay and fight versus when to walk away. She wrote about the difference between patience and accepting less than you deserve. She wrote about anger as fuel rather than poison. When she finally stopped, the sun had set completely. The city sparkled below her, millions of lives being lived, millions of stories being written. Somewhere down there, women were packing boxes after being fired. Women were working late solving problems others would take credit for. Women were wondering if they'd ever be seen. Andrea sent a silent message to all of them. I see you. Your work matters. Your insights are valuable. Your potential is real. And one day, when you're ready, you'll stop waiting for permission and start claiming what you've earned. I'll be here when you do, holding the door open. The next morning, Andrea woke early. Not from anxiety, but because she was excited about the day ahead. She had a meeting with a nonprofit that wanted to implement a version of the Hidden Leaders program. She had a conference call with a publisher interested in her second book. She had lunch with 3 former administrative assistants who'd started their own consulting firm and wanted her advice. Her life was full in ways that mattered, not with busy work or performance or proving, but with purpose, connection, and impact. At the office, Andrea found a gift on her desk, a plant in a ceramic pot with a card that read, "For the woman who taught us all to bloom, with gratitude, the Pierce and Matthews team." Andrea touched the leaves gently, feeling emotion rise. She'd been called many things in her career: secretary, assistant, support staff, just. But now she was being called what she'd always been, a leader, someone who made others better, someone who created space for growth. She placed the plant on her windowsill where it would catch morning light, a living reminder that growth was always possible. That transformation could happen at any age, that being dismissed didn't have to be the end of the story. It could be the beginning. Andrea sat at her desk in her office, in her company, and looked at the city stretching out below her. The same view she'd glimpsed from her small desk outside the partners' offices for 19 years. But everything was different now. She wasn't watching other people's success from the sidelines anymore. She was creating her own, and more importantly, she was creating pathways for others to create theirs. Her calendar pinged, first meeting in 15 minutes. A potential client who'd specifically requested to work with Pierce and Matthews because of their reputation for valuing people over pedigree. Andrea gathered her materials, checked her reflection in the window, confident, professional, exactly who she needed to be, and headed to the conference room. As she walked through the office, staff members greeted her warmly, not with the distant respect reserved for untouchable executives, but with genuine appreciation. She'd built a culture where people felt seen, where contributions mattered more than titles, where potential was recognized and developed. In the conference room, Andrea welcomed the potential client with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. "Thank you for considering Pierce and Matthews. Tell me about your challenges, and let's see if we're the right fit for each other." The meeting went well. Of course it did. Andrea knew how to listen, how to identify real needs versus surface problems, how to build relationships rather than just close deals. She'd been doing it for 22 years. The only difference now was that she was getting credit and compensation that matched her value. After the client left, Vivian stopped by Andrea's office. "I heard that went well." "It did," Andrea confirmed. They're signing a 6-month contract, wants us to help with organizational restructuring, specifically asked for leadership that understands what it's like to be undervalued in a system. Vivian smiled. Your lived experience has become your expertise. That's powerful. It's also heavy sometimes, Andrea admitted. Every woman who reaches out with her story of being dismissed, I feel the weight of that. I want to help everyone, but I can't. You can't help everyone individually, Vivian agreed, but you can create systems that help everyone collectively. The Hidden Leaders program, your books, your speaking, you're building infrastructure for change. That's more valuable than individual rescue. Andrea nodded, understanding intellectually even as her heart wanted to reach out to every woman who emailed her story. That afternoon, Andrea recorded a podcast interview about her journey. The host asked a question she'd been asked 100 times. What would you tell your younger self? Andrea paused, really thinking about it. I'd tell her that being underestimated isn't a reflection of her value. It's a reflection of a system that benefits from her invisibility. I'd tell her to start documenting everything from day one, to build skills strategically, to find allies who see her clearly, and most importantly, I'd tell her that she doesn't have to wait 19 years to claim her worth. She can start today. But would she listen? The host asked. Andrea laughed. Probably not. Sometimes we have to go through the pain to build the strength. Sometimes we have to be dismissed to learn to demand recognition. The journey matters. I wouldn't be the leader I am today if I hadn't spent 19 years being undervalued. That experience taught me empathy, resilience, and determination. It taught me what not to do as a leader. After the interview, Andrea checked her email and found one that made her stop breathing. The subject line read, "From a former colleague." The email was from Carolyn Bennett. Andrea, I wanted to tell you something I should have said 3 years ago. When Brett and Doug fired you, I was relieved. I thought it meant more opportunities for people like me, young, credentialed, ambitious. I didn't understand that I was celebrating a system that would eventually dismiss me too when I was no longer young enough or convenient enough. Working for you these past 3 years has taught me more about leadership than my MBA ever did. You've shown me that real power comes from lifting others up, not pushing them down. That competence matters more than credentials, that there's room for everyone to succeed. I'm leaving Pearson Matthews, not because I'm unhappy. I've never been happier professionally, but because I've learned from you that sometimes you need to build your own thing. I'm starting a consulting firm focused on helping women transition from administrative roles into professional positions, using everything you taught me. Thank you for seeing potential in me, even after I dismissed you. Thank you for modeling leadership that's based on character rather than ego. Thank you for showing me what's possible. With deep respect and gratitude, Carolyn. Andrea read the email 3 times, feeling pride and bittersweetness. Carolyn was leaving, but she was leaving to build something meaningful, the ripple effect continuing. Andrea typed her response. Carolyn, I'm incredibly proud of you. You took accountability, learned, and grew. That's all any of us can do. Go build something amazing. And when you do, hold the door open for the next woman coming up. That's how we change the world, one open door at a time. You'll always have my support. Andrea. 6 months later, Andrea stood on a stage at a sold-out conference for women in business. 5,000 women filled the auditorium, all hungry for stories of transformation, for proof that change was possible, for permission to claim their worth. My name is Andrea Campbell, she began. 3.5 years ago, I was fired from a job I'd held for 19 years. I was 52 years old, facing unemployment and terrified. Today, I own that company. But this isn't a story about revenge or luck. It's a story about finally valuing myself enough to fight for what I'd earned. She told her story with honesty. The dismissal, the fear, the audacious plan, the struggle, the transformation. But more importantly, She told the story of what came after, the ripple effects, the Hidden Leaders program, the women who'd found courage in her journey, the systemic changes one visible woman could create. "I'm not special," Andrea said, looking at thousands of faces. "I'm not exceptionally talented or uniquely brave. I'm just a woman who got tired of being small, who got angry enough to channel that anger into action, who decided that being underestimated didn't have to be permanent. Every single one of you has that same power. You don't need permission. You don't need credentials. You need clarity about your value and courage to claim it. Document your contributions, build your skills, find your allies, and when you're ready, when staying small feels worse than the risk of being seen, take your shot. You might fail. I almost did several times. But you know what's worse than failing while trying? Never trying at all, spending your life wondering what you could have been if you'd been brave enough to claim it." Andrea paused, emotion thick in her throat. 3.5 years ago, I was invisible. Today, I'm standing on this stage in front of 5,000 women, and my story is giving you permission to write your own. That's not luck. That's not special. That's what happens when you refuse to accept that being dismissed is the end of your story, when you make it the beginning instead. The standing ovation lasted 5 full minutes, women crying, cheering, holding up signs that said, "I see you and no longer invisible." Afterward, the line to speak with Andrea stretched through the convention center, women sharing stories, asking advice, seeking permission they didn't need but wanted anyway. Andrea stayed for 3 hours speaking with each person, looking them in the eyes, telling them what she wished someone had told her 20 years ago. "You're enough. You've always been enough. Now go prove it to yourself." The last woman in line was in her early 70s, tears streaming down her face. "Ms. Campbell, I'm 68 years old. I've been a paralegal for 40 years. Everyone tells me I'm too old to change careers now, but listening to you, I'm thinking maybe it's not too late." Andrea took the woman's hands in hers. "It's never too late to claim your worth. Never. Age is just another way society tries to keep women small. Don't accept it. You have decades of expertise. Use it. Build something. Demand recognition. Show them all that wisdom and experience are assets, not liabilities." The woman hugged her, whispering, "Thank you for making me believe it's possible." As Andrea finally left the convention center, exhausted but exhilarated, she thought about that woman, 68 and still fighting to be seen, still believing she might be too old, too late, too much. Andrea made a mental note to include a chapter in her next book specifically about age discrimination, about women who were told they were too young to lead, then too old to change, about refusing both narratives and writing your own story at any age. That night, back in her hotel room, Andrea video called Emma. "Mom, I saw clips from your speech online," Emma said, beaming. "You're changing lives. Do you realize that?" "I'm just telling my story," Andrea said. "No," Emma corrected gently. "You're giving people permission to tell theirs. That's different. That's bigger." Andrea thought about the line of women at the conference, the emails she received daily, the companies implementing Hidden Leaders programs, the young professionals demanding recognition from day one instead of waiting 19 years, the older professionals refusing to accept that their time had passed. "I guess I am," Andrea said slowly. "I spent so long being invisible that I forgot visibility could be used for something beyond myself. I'm still learning that lesson." "Keep learning," Emma said. "The world needs more leaders like you. People who remember what it felt like to be dismissed, who lead with empathy instead of ego, who use their power to create more power for others." After they hung up, Andrea opened her laptop and began writing the final chapter of her second book. She titled it, "The Rest of Your Life." "This is not the end of the story," she wrote. "It's the middle. There will be more challenges, more moments of doubt, more times when the old voice whispers that you're not enough. But now you know the truth. That voice was never yours. It was the voice of systems that benefited from your invisibility. And you don't have to listen anymore. The rest of your life stretches out before you, full of possibility. What will you build? Who will you become? What doors will you open for others? These aren't rhetorical questions, they're invitations. Invitations to stop waiting, stop apologizing, stop accepting less than you deserve. I'm 55 now, 3.5 years into being visible, and I have decades left to build, to lead, to create change. So do you. Age doesn't diminish your value, it amplifies your wisdom. Experience doesn't limit your potential, it expands your perspective. So here's my final advice. Start now, today, this moment. Stop waiting for permission that will never come. Stop accepting stories other people write about who you're allowed to be. Start claiming your worth, documenting your value, building your future. And when you do, when you finally step into your power and refuse to shrink anymore, reach back and help the next woman coming up behind you. That's how we change everything. Not one woman breaking through alone, but millions of women holding doors open for each other, creating a world where being underestimated is no longer the default, where visibility is expected, not exceptional. That's the world I'm building. Will you help me build it? Your story matters. Your voice matters. Your presence matters. Use them. The rest of your life is waiting. Make it extraordinary. Andrea saved the document, feeling the weight and rightness of those words. Her journey from invisible to unavoidable had been painful and transformative. But the journey wasn't over. It was evolving. From personal transformation to collective change. From one woman claiming her worth to a movement of women refusing to stay small. She looked at the city lights outside her hotel window, a different city than Chicago, but the same pattern of lives being lived, stories being written. Somewhere in those buildings, women were working late solving problems others would take credit for. Women were packing boxes after being dismissed. Women were wondering if they'd ever be enough. Andrea sent them a message across the distance. You're already enough. You just need to believe it. And when you do, everything changes. I promise. Andrea went from dismissed secretary to empowered CEO, not through luck, but through courage, strategy, and refusing to accept being invisible. If her journey resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Weathered Rose Stories for more empowering narratives of women who refuse to stay small. What's your story of reclaiming your power? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today. Remember, you're not just anything. You're everything you need to be. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, keep blooming.